Black teen forced off the plane. Moments later, her father's jet blocks the runway. The flight attendant's voice was as cold and sterile as the recycled air in the cabin. "Mom, I need you to gather your belongings and come with me." 17-year-old Jade Bennett looked up, her heart pounding against her ribs. Every eye on the crowded Boeing 737 was locked on her. This couldn't be happening. She had a window seat. Her ticket was valid. Her bag was properly stowed. But the woman next to her, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, had decided Jade didn't belong, and somehow that decision had transformed into action. Just moments from realizing her dream of attending a prestigious summer program at CalTech, Jade was being publicly humiliated, treated like an intruder in a space she had every right to occupy. Little did anyone know that in exactly 23 minutes, Dominic Bennett's $78 million Gulfstream G800 would bring Newark Liberty International Airport to a complete standstill and cost Aurora Airlines more than its executives could possibly imagine. The cabin seemed to contract around Jade. The gentle hum of the idle engines suddenly felt thunderous in her ears. She could feel the heat of judgment radiating from the other passengers, some curious, some uncomfortable, some already recording with their phones. The weight of being seen, being noticed, being singled out, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. "Miss, I won't ask again," Melissa said louder this time, her practiced customer service smile never reaching her eyes. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story of discrimination power and a father's extraordinary response, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. If you believe everyone deserves dignity and respect regardless of who they are or how they look, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Now, let's return to that tense moment on Aurora Airlines Flight 2237, where one teenager's journey was about to take an unexpected turn. Jade Bennett was not a typical 17-year-old. With a perfect 5.0 GPA, 3 published research papers, and early admission offers from the nation's top universities, she had already accomplished more than most adults. Yet sitting there in seat 14A, she felt as small and powerless as a child. The CalTech Summer Quantum Computing program had been her dream since freshman year of high school. She'd prepared her application for months, polishing every sentence of her essay until it gleamed with promise. When the acceptance letter arrived, she'd cried not just because she'd achieved her goal, but because it represented something more profound validation that her mind mattered more than her appearance. Growing up as the daughter of a prominent black businessman had taught Jade early lessons about duality. At home, she was brilliant, beloved, boundless in potential. In public, she was scrutinized, sometimes feared, often underestimated. She'd learned to carry herself with a careful dignity, to speak precisely, to keep her voice measured, even when anger burned in her chest. Jade's worn copy of Quantum Computing, since Democritus, peeked out from her backpack. She'd read it 3 times, making meticulous notes in the margins. Physics made sense to her in a way people often didn't. It followed rules, consistent patterns, predictable outcomes. People were messier, governed by biases and assumptions that no equation could fully capture. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple CalTech sweatshirt paired with dark jeans, comfortable clothes for the 6-hour flight from Newark to Los Angeles. Nothing about her appearance warranted attention, and that was by design. Jade had mastered the art of blending in while standing out only for her intellect. Now, as Melissa Turner loomed over her seat, Jade felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The physical manifestation of an unfair choice: speak up and be labeled difficult, or comply and surrender her dignity. Her father had warned her about these moments, had prepared her for them, but experiencing them still stung like the first time. "What seems to be the problem?" Jade asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She knew the answer before the question left her lips. The problem wasn't her ticket, her bag, or anything she had said or done. The problem was simpler and more complex. She had claimed space in a world that still sometimes questioned her right to exist in it. 23 miles away in a sleek corner office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, Dominic Bennett was reviewing quarterly projections when his watch vibrated with an alert. He glanced down, expecting a routine notification, but froze when he saw the source, Jade Safety Alert. Dominic Bennett was a man whose presence filled rooms before he even spoke. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and the disciplined posture of his military past, he commanded attention not through intimidation, but through the quiet confidence of someone who had fought for everything he'd achieved. Deep laugh lines around his eyes contradicted the serious set of his mouth, evidence of a man who found joy despite knowing too much about the world's harsher realities. He'd built Bennett Network Solutions from nothing but determination and a second-hand laptop. After serving 8 years as an Air Force intelligence officer, he'd applied to 23 venture capital firms with his innovative logistics software. 23 rejections followed, many from investors who funded less qualified white entrepreneurs with inferior business plans. So Dominic bootstrapped instead, working nights as a security consultant while coding during every free moment. When his big break finally came, a contract with a mid-sized shipping company, he'd executed it with such precision that 3 more contracts followed. 5 years later, BNS was handling logistics for Fortune 500 companies. 10 years later, it had revolutionized supply chain management across 4 continents. Now, at 45, Dominic was worth just over $2 billion, though you'd never guess it from his modest Patek Philippe watch and off-the-rack suits. But no achievement in his professional life compared to Jade. From the moment he'd first held his daughter, Dominic had made one promise: her path would be easier than his. Not without challenges, he knew better than to expect that. But she would have resources he never had. Doors would open more readily. And most importantly, she would never face injustice alone. He'd taught her everything: how to code, how to change a tire, how to invest wisely. But his most important lessons were the unwritten rules of navigating spaces not designed with her in mind. Walk like you belong because you do, he'd tell her, but always know where the exits are. It wasn't fair that she needed these lessons. But Dominic Bennett hadn't built his life on fairness. He'd built it on reality, and then worked to change that reality. Now, staring at the alert on his watch, a cold fury settled in his chest. Someone had flagged Jade's ticket as potentially fraudulent. The credit card monitoring system he'd implemented after a previous incident at a high-end store had triggered. He reached for his phone, his mind already calculating, planning, preparing for battle in the quiet, methodical way that had made him both a successful entrepreneur and a formidable adversary. Andrea, he called to his executive assistant. "Get me the security feed from Newark." Now. The energy in Newark Liberty International's Terminal C had pulsed with a unique rhythm that morning, a symphony of rolling suitcases, final boarding calls, and tearful goodbyes. For Jade, it had been the soundtrack of her future beginning. She'd arrived 3 hours early, giving herself ample time to navigate security and find her gate without rushing. Time management was second nature to her. Dominic had instilled that particular discipline since she was old enough to read a clock. Being early is being on time, he would say. Being on time is being late. The sprawling terminal windows had offered a panoramic view of the tarmac, a metropolis of metal birds preparing for flight. Jade had found a quiet corner near gate C12, settled into a chair facing the massive windows, and pulled out her phone to make one essential call before boarding. Her father's face had filled the screen. His office backdrop a testament to his success, not ostentatious, but undeniably premium. Original artwork by emerging black artists adorned the walls, and the Manhattan skyline provided a cinematic backdrop through floor-to-ceiling windows. "There's my quantum genius," Dominic had boomed, his serious expression dissolving into the smile he reserved only for her. Ready to show those CalTech professors what a Bennett can do. Jade had laughed, the sound bright and clear against the airport's ambient noise. Dad, I'm just trying not to get lost on campus the first day. Details. He'd waved dismissively. You've earned this, Ladybug. You've worked harder than anyone I know. He'd leaned closer to the camera, then his expression softening. You got everything, ticket ID. The portable charger I made you pack. Yes, Dad, she'd replied, rolling her eyes playfully. For the 10th time, I'm fine. I'm a big girl now, remember? You'll always be my little girl, he'd said, his voice dropping an octave. Even when you're building quantum computers that make my security systems look like calculator watches. Their familiar banter had continued, but beneath it ran the current of unspoken understanding. When he'd said, be aware of your surroundings, okay? Not everyone sees the world the way we do. They both knew what he meant. It was the distillation of 1,000 previous conversations about navigating spaces as a young black woman in America, conversations no father wanted to have, but that Dominic considered as essential to her safety as looking both ways before crossing the street. After promising to call when she landed, Jade had ended the video chat with their ritual sign-off, love you more than quantum entanglement. It was nerdy and perfect and entirely theirs. The boarding process for Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 had begun smoothly. First class, business class, premium economy. Then, finally, Group 3 rows, 12 through 18. You may now board through Gate C12. Jade had gathered her backpack and carry-on ticket clutched firmly in hand and joined the orderly queue. Her boarding pass showed seat 14A, a window seat she'd specifically selected to watch the sprawling concrete jungle of Newark shrink beneath her as she flew toward her dreams. The line had moved slowly, a cross-section of humanity shuffling forward. Businessmen in wrinkled suits tapped furiously on their phones. A young family with a crying baby tried to soothe their distressed infant. College students buzzed with excitement about their destinations. Jade had kept to herself earbuds playing a lo-fi playlist that helped soothe her pre-flight jitters. As she'd scanned her boarding pass and entered the jet bridge, Jade had felt a final exhilarating surge of independence. This was it. The journey was officially beginning. She had no way of knowing it was about to take a detour she could never have anticipated. When Jade found row 14, her assigned window seat was waiting, but so was Victoria Aldridge. The woman, who appeared to be in her late 50s, occupied the aisle seat with the territorial air of someone who considered adjacent spaces her personal domain. Her helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair didn't move when she looked up, and the string of pearls around her neck caught the overhead lights as she gave Jade a slow, evaluative once-over. "Excuse me," Jade said politely, gesturing toward the window. "I'm in 14A. Victoria's gaze traveled from Jade's comfortable CalTech sweatshirt to her sensible sneakers, then to her natural hair. A faint, almost imperceptible frown creased her lips, creating tiny fissures in her immaculate makeup. She didn't move. "That's my seat," Jade repeated, her smile tightening just a fraction. Victoria finally sighed a sound of profound inconvenience and gathered her oversized designer handbag from the middle seat. "Of course," she muttered, standing only partially, forcing Jade to awkwardly squeeze past their bodies, brushing uncomfortably. Jade settled into 14A, her excitement slightly dimmed by the chilly reception. She placed her backpack under the seat in front of her and buckled her seatbelt, turning her attention to the window and the ballet of ground crew and baggage carts outside. She was determined not to let one sour interaction spoil this moment. She was on her way, she was flying, but the tension in row 14 was just beginning to build. The cabin of the Boeing 737 hummed with pre-flight activity as passengers found their seats hoisted carry-ons into overhead bins and settled in for the 6-hour journey to Los Angeles. Jade, having successfully navigated past Victoria Aldridge, tried to recapture her earlier excitement. She watched a massive Airbus A380 lumber toward its gate, a giant of the skies, making the ground crew look like miniature figures from her perspective. Victoria, however, was not one to let perceived territorial encroachments go unchallenged. After placing her Louis Vuitton bag on the empty middle seat as if it were a paying passenger, she began to arrange her space with an air of theatrical fussiness. She pulled out a silk shawl, a bottle of Evian water, a leather-bound journal, and the latest issue of Forbes, creating a clear demarcation zone between herself and Jade. Jade was acutely aware of the woman's movements in her peripheral vision. She tried to make herself smaller, pressing closer to the window, though she was already occupying minimal space. The edge of her backpack, tucked under the seat in front of her, was apparently encroaching on Victoria's foot space by some microscopic measure. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice sharp and loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Your bag is touching my foot." Jade blinked, looking down. The soft canvas of her backpack was perhaps a centimeter into the space under the middle seat. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, genuinely apologetic, and nudged the bag with her foot, pulling it tighter against the support struts of her own seat. "Is that better?" Victoria let out another theatrical sigh. "I would appreciate it if you would keep your belongings in your designated area. Some of us paid a premium for these seats and expect a certain level of comfort." Jade knew for a fact that they were in standard economy class. There was no premium about row 14. She felt a flush of irritation rise up her neck, but swallowed it down. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "Don't give anyone a reason." It was his shorthand for the unfair reality that the same behaviors judged as assertive in others would be labeled aggressive when coming from her. "Of course," she replied, her voice neutral. "My apologies." She put her earbuds back in, hoping it was the end of the interaction, but Victoria Aldridge was just warming up. The boarding process was nearly complete, and the middle seat between them remained empty, a small blessing that Jade hoped would act as a buffer zone of neutrality. Just as the cabin door was about to close, a flight attendant named Melissa Turner, her face etched with the weariness of someone on their fourth flight of the day, began her final cabin checks. Victoria flagged her down with an imperious wave of her manicured hand. Miss Victoria began, her voice dripping with faux concern. "I just want to ensure that this young person has the correct seat assignment. She seems unsure of where she belongs." Jade's stomach dropped. She removed one earbud, prepared to defend herself, but the groundwork for what was about to unfold had already been laid with careful precision. The first seeds of doubt had been planted, and they would soon grow into something that would alter the course of multiple lives before the day was through. Victoria Aldridge was a strategist in the theater of public confrontation. Her first complaint about the backpack had merely been a preliminary move testing the waters. Finding no resistance, she escalated with the tactical precision of someone who had spent a lifetime crafting conflicts to her advantage. 20 minutes into boarding, with the middle seat between them still blissfully empty, Victoria's campaign intensified. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, casting pointed glances at Jade's earbuds. "Your music," she said, not bothering to wait for Jade to remove her earbuds voluntarily. "I can hear every beat. It's quite disruptive." Jade removed her earbuds, completely puzzled. The volume was so low she could barely hear it herself. "I'm sorry," she said, reflexively apologizing again. "I'll turn it down." "It's not just the volume," Victoria continued, wrinkling her nose slightly. "It's the type of music. Not everyone appreciates that particular genre." The implication hung in the air, though Victoria had been careful not to specify what genre she meant, maintaining plausible deniability while sending a clear message. Jade had been listening to classical piano compositions, her pre-flight ritual to calm her nerves, but the assumption spoke volumes. Other passengers were beginning to take notice of the one-sided conflict. In row 13, a Hispanic woman in her early 40s, later identified as Elena Rodriguez, a pediatric nurse traveling to visit her sister, made brief eye contact with Jade, offering a small, sympathetic smile. The gesture, though fleeting, provided a moment of solidarity that Jade deeply appreciated. Across the aisle, in 14D, Richard Palmer, a white businessman in his mid-50s, wearing a charcoal suit with a subtle pinstripe, glanced up from his Wall Street Journal. He frowned slightly at Victoria's tone, clearly registering the inappropriateness of her behavior, but then just as quickly returned to his newspaper, choosing the comfort of non-involvement. In row 15, directly behind them, a group of college students exchanged glances. One of them, a young woman with a nose ring and brightly colored hair, discreetly positioned her phone to capture the interaction, her instinct for documenting potential injustice overriding airplane etiquette. Victoria seemed to feed off the growing audience, emboldened by the attention. She adjusted her pearl necklace and shifted again, this time dramatically covering her nose with a scented handkerchief she extracted from her purse. "Oh," she murmured, just loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "That's quite a strong, personal fragrance." Jade froze. She was wearing no perfume, had never worn perfume on flights out of consideration for passengers with allergies. The accusation was both baseless and pointed, designed to construct a narrative of Jade as intrusive, unpleasant, and fundamentally out of place. "I'm not wearing any scent," Jade said quietly, maintaining her composure, though her chest tightened with the effort. "Perhaps it's the cleaning products they use on the seats." Victoria's eyes narrowed at this logical defense. "I've flown Aurora Airlines over 200 times, and I've never noticed such an odor before today." The implication was clear. The problem wasn't the seat, the problem was its occupant. Victoria's next move was to extract a travel-sized bottle of expensive hand sanitizer from her purse and ostentatiously apply it, the sharp alcohol smell cutting through the cabin's filtered air. Elena Rodriguez from row 13 turned around completely now, no longer bothering to hide her disapproval of Victoria's behavior. "Excuse me," she said in a measured tone, "but I think the only strong smell here is coming from that sanitizer. Would you mind putting it away? Some of us are sensitive to chemical fragrances." Victoria's eyes widened at this unexpected challenge, her carefully constructed performance interrupted by an unscripted intervention. "I'm simply maintaining hygiene standards," she replied stiffly. "As a frequent flyer, I'm well aware of the dangers of close-quarter bacterial transmission." The exchange created a moment of disruption in Victoria's carefully escalating narrative, but rather than deterring her, it only steeled her resolve. If her subtle approach wasn't working as efficiently as planned, perhaps a more direct strategy was required. Her gaze swept the cabin, locking onto Melissa Turner, who was assisting an elderly passenger several rows ahead. Victoria's finger hovered over the call button, ready to summon the authority she needed to complete what she had started. Meanwhile, Jade sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence, feeling the weight of unwanted attention press down on her. What should have been the exciting first leg of her journey to CalTech had transformed into a tense standoff, with her assigned seat becoming contested territory, and her very presence framed as an intrusion. She reached for her phone, considered texting her father, then decided against it. She could handle this herself. She had to. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft ding, accompanied by the captain's voice welcoming everyone to Aurora Airlines Flight 22237 to Los Angeles. As the safety demonstration began, Victoria's finger finally descended on the call button, its sharp electronic chime cutting through the rehearsed instructions. Melissa Turner's head turned toward row 14, her professional smile barely masking her annoyance at the interruption. The confrontation was about to enter its next, more dangerous phase. Victoria Aldridge didn't wait for Melissa Turner to fully reach their row before launching her offensive. Her voice, pitched to carry just far enough to create a scene without appearing to deliberately do so, cut through the cabin's ambient noise. "Miss, I have concerns about the passenger in 14A, she announced, gesturing toward Jade with a slight tilt of her chin. "I believe there may be a seating mix-up." Melissa arrived at row 14, her customer service smile firmly in place despite the visible fatigue around her eyes. "How can I help you, ma'am?" she asked, addressing Victoria with the deference typically reserved for the airline's most valued customers. Victoria leaned forward conspiratorially, though her volume ensured nearby passengers could still hear every word. "I don't believe this young woman is supposed to be in first class. There seems to be some confusion." Jade's head snapped up. "This isn't first class. She set her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. "This is Economy Row 14. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Economy Comfort Plus," she corrected, though no such designation existed on this particular aircraft. "It's a premium section with certain standards." The word standards hung in the air like a judgment. Melissa looked between the two passengers, clearly trying to assess the situation with minimal effort. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" she asked, Jade extending her hand. Jade reached into her sweatshirt pocket and produced her boarding pass, which clearly indicated seat 14A. "I'm in my assigned seat," she said, handing the document to Melissa. Melissa examined the boarding pass, nodding. "This appears to be in order." Victoria interrupted, her voice taking on an edge of indignation. "But surely you can see that something isn't right. Certain passengers try to upgrade themselves without proper authorization. I've seen it happen before." The implication was impossible to miss. Around them, the cabin had grown quieter, the background conversations dimming as passengers tuned into the unfolding drama. The college student behind them was openly filming now, her phone capturing every word. "My ticket is valid," Jade stated, keeping her voice low but firm. "I purchased it myself with my own credit card. There's been no attempt to upgrade anything." Victoria's eyebrows arched in exaggerated disbelief. "A young person like yourself purchased a premium economy ticket with your own credit card. That's unusual." The word unusual was loaded with assumptions about what Jade could or could not afford, what spaces she could or could not legitimately occupy. It was a familiar coding that Jade had encountered before, though rarely so blatantly. "I don't see how my method of payment is relevant," Jade replied, feeling her carefully maintained composure beginning to fray at the edges. "The fact is, I'm in my assigned seat with a valid ticket." Melissa shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to move on, but caught in Victoria's carefully spun web of insinuation. "If the boarding pass matches, then there's no issue. I insist you verify her identification." Victoria pressed her voice, dropping to a stage whisper. "These premium seats are often obtained fraudulently. The ticket could belong to someone else entirely." Jade felt heat rising to her face, a mixture of humiliation and simmering anger. The cabin seemed to close in around her, dozens of eyes now openly watching the confrontation. Richard Palmer across the aisle had finally lowered his newspaper completely, his expression troubled but still passive. Elena Rodriguez had half risen from her seat, clearly considering a more direct intervention. "I have ID," Jade said, reaching for her wallet. She extracted her driver's license and handed it to Melissa, the action itself feeling like a surrender to an unjust demand. "My name is Jade Bennett. The ticket is in my name." Melissa compared the ID to the boarding pass, then handed both back to Jade with a nod. "Everything matches. The passenger is in her correct seat." But Victoria wasn't finished. Her strategy shifted from questioning the ticket's validity to manufacturing concerns about Jade herself. "She's been acting erratically since boarding," she claimed, inventing a new narrative on the spot. Playing loud music, making unusual movements, giving off strange odors. Each accusation was calibrated to trigger specific concerns in an aircraft environment. Unusual behavior on planes was a red flag in post-9/11 aviation. Victoria was essentially painting Jade as a potential security risk, all because she had dared to occupy the window seat beside her. "That's completely false," Jade said, her voice finally showing the strain of maintaining composure in the face of such blatant fabrications. "I've been sitting quietly listening to classical piano at low volume and haven't moved from this seat since boarding." The college student behind them spoke up unexpectedly. "I've been recording," she announced. "The only person acting strangely in this row is the older lady making false accusations." A murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Victoria's face tightened momentarily before she recovered, shifting tactics once again. "I feel threatened," she declared, placing a hand dramatically over her heart. "I cannot possibly fly seated next to someone who makes me feel unsafe. This is unacceptable." It was a masterstroke of manipulation, reframing her own discriminatory behavior as justified fear, positioning herself as the victim rather than the aggressor. Melissa glanced nervously toward the front of the cabin, clearly looking for backup from her supervisor. "I'll need to get my supervisor," she said, the path of least resistance already forming in her mind. "Please remain seated for now." As Melissa hurried away, Victoria settled back into her seat with the satisfied expression of someone who had just executed a perfect chess move. She didn't look at Jade, didn't need to. The damage had been done with surgical precision. Jade sat perfectly still, feeling as if she were balanced on the edge of a precipice. She pulled out her phone, opened her messaging app, and began typing to her father. "Something's happening on the flight. They're questioning my right to be here." Her finger hovered over the send button for a moment before she pressed it, the message disappearing into the digital ether just as Melissa returned with her supervisor, Thomas Wilson, in tow. The next few minutes would change the trajectory of multiple lives, though none of the participants yet realized the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Thomas Wilson approached row 14 with the confident stride of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts through authority rather than understanding. At 47, his receding hairline and the permanent crease between his eyebrows spoke of years handling the peculiar stress of airline operations. His name badge glinted under the cabin lights, the title Customer Service Supervisor positioned prominently beneath his name. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, addressing the question to the cabin at large rather than to any specific individual. It was a technique designed to appear neutral while allowing the most dominant personality to seize narrative control. Victoria didn't waste the opportunity. "This passenger," she began gesturing toward Jade without looking at her, "has been behaving in a concerning manner. I've expressed to your colleague that I feel uncomfortable and potentially unsafe." Thomas turned to Melissa. "What have you verified so far? I've checked her boarding pass and ID." Melissa replied, lowering her voice slightly. "Both match and confirm she's in her assigned seat." Thomas nodded, absorbing this information while scanning the increasingly restless passengers around them. Flight 2237 was already 15 minutes behind schedule. Each additional minute of delay would cascade through the airline's operations for the rest of the day, potentially affecting dozens of flights. His performance metrics, on-time departures, customer satisfaction scores, conflict resolution, efficiency flashed through his mind like warning lights. He leaned closer to Melissa, initiating a whispered exchange that wasn't quite quiet enough to prevent Jade from catching fragments. "What's the passenger load today?" he asked. 87%, Melissa replied. "There's room in economy further back." Thomas glanced at Victoria, then at Jade, making rapid calculations that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with expediency. Who's more likely to escalate this? Who's a frequent flyer? Who's the path of least resistance? The answers were obvious, and they formed a disturbing equation where Jade's dignity became collateral damage in the service of operational efficiency. It wasn't personal animus driving his decision, it was something perhaps more insidious, institutional convenience. "Miss Bennett," Thomas said, turning to Jade with what he likely considered a reasonable tone, "we seem to have a situation here that's causing discomfort for multiple passengers. The only person expressing discomfort is her." "Jade," replied, gesturing toward Victoria. "And it's based on nothing but her own prejudice." Victoria gasped theatrically. "How dare you?" "This is exactly the hostile attitude I've been concerned about." Thomas raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's stay calm. Our priority is ensuring a safe, comfortable flight for everyone." The words sounded noble but rang hollow in their execution. "In situations like these, we have protocols to follow." "What protocols specifically address unfounded accusations from one passenger about another?" Jade asked, her composure maintained despite the tremor in her voice. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. When there's a conflict between passengers, we need to resolve it before takeoff. Company policy gives us discretion to reassign seating when necessary for cabin harmony. Cabin harmony, Jade repeated incredulously. You mean appeasing someone making discriminatory assumptions? I'm not making assumptions, Victoria interjected. I'm reporting observed behaviors that make me uncomfortable. Thomas glanced at his watch. Flight 2237 was now 20 minutes delayed. The captain would be calling soon, asking for status. Ground operations would be adjusting the departure queue. The domino effect of delay was beginning. Miss Bennett, he said, his decision already made, though he presented it as if it were still under consideration. We can offer you a seat in row 32, still a window seat, or we can rebook you on the next flight to Los Angeles. The injustice of the offer hung in the air. Jade was being punished for nothing more than existing in a space someone else had decided she didn't belong in. The college student behind them gasped audibly at the unfairness, and Elena Rodriguez muttered something that sounded like absolutely shameful in Spanish. You're asking me to move because of unfounded complaints, Jade clarified, wanting the reality of the situation to be explicitly acknowledged. Thomas avoided direct engagement with the question. We're offering alternatives to resolve the current situation so the flight can proceed. The situation, Jade said carefully, is that I'm being discriminated against, and instead of addressing that, you're enabling it. Thomas stiffened, clearly uncomfortable with having the subtext made text. No one is discriminating against anyone. This is standard conflict resolution. Victoria smiled thinly, the satisfaction of impending victory visible in her expression. I'm a platinum member with over 100,000 miles this year alone, she added, playing her final card. I would hope Aurora Airlines values loyal customers. And there it was, the true currency of the confrontation revealed. Thomas's decision crystallized, any pretense of deliberation abandoned. Miss Bennett, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your belongings and come with me. We'll find you appropriate accommodations on another flight. The college student behind them stood up. This is wrong, and you know it, she said, her phone still recording. I'm going to post this everywhere. Please return to your seat, Thomas said firmly. Interfering with crew member instructions is a violation of federal aviation regulations. Elena Rodriguez also rose from her seat. I'm a witness to what's happening here. This young woman has done absolutely nothing wrong. The situation was escalating beyond Thomas's control, exactly what he'd hoped to avoid. His face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and determination. Miss Bennett, he repeated, his voice taking on an edge of authority. Please collect your items now. Jade sat perfectly still for a long moment, weighing her options. She could refuse, escalate the confrontation further, possibly even be forcibly removed, all of which would only reinforce the narrative Victoria had so carefully constructed about her being threatening or unstable. Or she could walk away with her dignity intact, surrendering the battle but ensuring the incident would not end here. With deliberate calm, she reached for her backpack and stood. I want your names, she said to Thomas and Melissa. Both of you. And I want it noted in your report that I complied under protest, having done nothing to warrant removal. Thomas nodded stiffly, relieved that physical intervention wouldn't be necessary. Your cooperation is appreciated. As Jade prepared to leave the seat, she had every right to occupy. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. The message from her father had gone through, and his response had just arrived. Where exactly are you? What's happening? But before she could reply, Melissa spoke the words that would set in motion consequences. None of them could possibly anticipate. The girl in 14A needs to gather her belongings and come with me. Now. I understand what's happening, Jade said, rising slowly from her seat, her voice clear and measured, despite the emotion threatening to break through. My ticket is valid. My ID is correct. My behavior has been appropriate. The only thing suspicious about me is the color of my skin." A hush fell over the cabin. The brutal honesty of her statement hung in the air like a challenge daring anyone to deny the obvious truth it contained. Thomas Wilson's face tightened, but he couldn't contradict her without making the situation worse. "This way, please," he said, instead gesturing toward the front of the aircraft. Jade took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle, conscious of every eye upon her. The walk felt impossibly long each step, carrying her past rows of strangers, bearing witness to her humiliation. Some averted their eyes in uncomfortable silence. Others watched with open curiosity, as if she were a character in a reality show, rather than a human being experiencing injustice in real time. Elena Rodriguez reached out as Jade passed briefly, touching her arm in solidarity. "This isn't right," she said clearly. "I'm filing a formal complaint." The college student with the phone was still recording. "I've got all of it," she assured Jade. "Every single word." A middle-aged black woman near the front of the cabin shook her head in sad recognition, making momentary eye contact with Jade a silent acknowledgement of a shared experience that needed no explanation. Richard Palmer, the businessman who had noticed but said nothing, suddenly spoke up as Jade passed his seat. "Is this really necessary?" he asked Thomas. "The young lady hasn't done anything." But his intervention came too late, a whispered protest after the verdict had already been delivered. Thomas didn't even bother responding, continuing to escort Jade toward the front of the aircraft, with Melissa following behind. As they approached the exit, Jade felt her phone vibrating insistently in her pocket. Her father was calling now, probably alarmed by her text and subsequent silence. She couldn't answer, not yet, not while being marched off the plane like a criminal. They reached the aircraft door where a gate agent waited with a puzzled expression. Thomas leaned in, speaking quietly to her about rebooking and customer comfort issues, carefully dancing around the reality of what was actually occurring. Before stepping onto the jet bridge, Jade turned to face the cabin one last time. She wanted to say something profound, something that would make this moment matter beyond her own experience, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply held her head high, a final act of dignity in the face of indignity. As the aircraft door closed behind her, sealing Victoria Aldridge's victory, Jade finally pulled out her phone. 3 missed calls from her father and a stream of increasingly urgent text messages filled the screen. "What's happening?" "Jade, call me immediately." "Are you okay? I'm tracking your phone location. Still at the gate. Call me now." With trembling fingers, she pressed the call button. Dominic answered on the first ring. "Dad," she said, her voice finally breaking. "They kicked me off the plane. This woman next to me, she made up things about me, said I didn't belong there, and they believed her. They took her side." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, a silence that contained multitudes, rage, calculation, decision. When Dominic spoke again, his voice was terrifyingly calm. "Where are you exactly right now, Terminal C Gate 12? They're talking about rebooking me, but stay exactly where you are." Dominic interrupted each word, deliberate and precise. "Do not accept any rebooking. Do not move from that gate. I'm coming." "Dad." "You don't have to, Ladybug," he said, using the childhood nickname that had always made her feel safe. "This ends now. 23 minutes. That's all I need. Just stay where you are." The call ended and Jade stood in the bustling terminal, feeling strangely calm despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. 23 minutes. She didn't know what her father meant by that, couldn't possibly anticipate what was about to unfold. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: Dominic Bennett never made promises he couldn't keep. Inside the aircraft, Flight 2237 was finally preparing for pushback. Victoria Aldridge had spread her belongings across both seats, a physical claiming of the territory she'd fought so hard to protect. Thomas Wilson was explaining the delay to the increasingly irritated captain. And somewhere in the cabin, a college student was uploading a video that would soon reach hundreds of thousands of viewers with the caption, "Racism at 30,000 feet. Watch this black teen get kicked off for absolutely nothing." Meanwhile, in a sleek office 23 miles away, a sophisticated monitoring system pinged with an alert that would eventually cost Aurora Airlines millions of dollars. Bennett Jade. Credit card authorization dispute. Fraudulent activity flag. High priority. The system, designed by Dominic Bennett himself to track suspicious financial activity targeting minority cardholders, had done its job. It had identified Jade's ticket as being flagged for verification, despite all charges being legitimate. The digital breadcrumbs of discrimination were already being collected, cataloged, and prepared as evidence. But Dominic wasn't thinking about evidence or financial damages as he grabbed his jacket and strode toward the elevator. He was thinking about his daughter standing alone in an airport terminal, having just experienced exactly what he had spent her entire life trying to protect her from. He was thinking about promises, the ones society had broken and the one he had made to himself the day she was born. Andrea, he called to his executive assistant as he passed her desk. Cancel everything. Then call Jackson. Tell him to prep the G800 immediately. We're flying to Newark. Andrea Martinez looked up, startled by the controlled fury in her boss's voice. "What should I tell the board about the quarterly review meeting?" Dominic paused at the elevator, his expression unnervingly calm. "Tell them I'm teaching a masterclass in consequences." As the elevator doors closed, he pulled out his phone and made another call, this one to his head of security. "Access the Newark Liberty security feeds. I want eyes on Terminal C Gate 12. My daughter is there. And I want everything you can find on Aurora Airlines Flight 2237, scheduled for departure to Los Angeles. Crew names, passenger manifest, everything. 23 minutes. The countdown had begun. The 47th floor of Bennett Tower offered a commanding view of Manhattan's skyline, a visual representation of the power housed within its walls. Dominic's corner office was a careful balance of understated luxury and functional precision. African mahogany desk, ergonomic chair designed for his 6'2" frame, and walls adorned with original artwork from emerging black artists he had supported through his foundation. But Dominic barely noticed these familiar surroundings as he stared at his phone screen, reading the alert that had just changed the course of his day. Bennett Jade. Credit card authorization dispute. Fraudulent activity flag. High priority. The BNS financial protection system he had developed 3 years ago after Jade's credit card had been declined at a high-end boutique, despite having ample funds, was designed to track suspicious flags on minority cardholders' accounts. It monitored transactions in real-time, identifying patterns consistent with discriminatory practices. The system had just detected that Jade's ticket purchase, despite being completely legitimate, had been flagged for verification by Aurora Airlines' fraud detection algorithm. Sir Andrea Martinez stood in the doorway, her expression concerned. At 35, she had worked alongside Dominic for 7 years, rising from executive assistant to become his chief of staff. She had never seen him this still, this focused, this quietly furious. "The security feed from Newark is coming through now." With a gesture, Dominic transferred the feed to the large screen on his office wall. The high-definition security camera footage showed various angles of Terminal C. Andrea tapped on her tablet, cycling through different cameras until they found Gate C12. There was Jade standing near the gate desk, her posture rigid with contained emotion as she spoke on her phone, speaking to him. Dominic realized in that moment of synchronicity. "Can you access the aircraft cameras?" he asked, his voice unnaturally calm. Andrea nodded, her fingers moving across the tablet with practiced efficiency. "BNS manages the security infrastructure for 3 major airlines, including Aurora," she confirmed. "We should have access to their internal feed through our maintenance portal." The screen split, and suddenly they were looking at the interior of Flight 2237. The feed showed passengers settling into their seats. Flight attendants moving through the cabin, and there in row 14 a blonde woman arranging her belongings across 2 seats with an air of entitled victory. Victoria Aldridge, Andrea read from the passenger manifest that had appeared on her tablet. Seat 14C, Platinum member with Aurora, booked through Aldridge Consulting corporate account. She looked up at Dominic. Want me to run a full background? Everything Dominic confirmed, still watching the screen. And get me Thomas Wilson's employee file. He's the supervisor who removed my daughter from that aircraft. Melissa Turner, too. She's the flight attendant who initiated the removal. Andrea was already typing. Accessing Aurora's HR database through our security contract permissions. She paused, glancing at Dominic. Sir, what exactly are we planning here? Dominic finally turned from the screen, his expression shifting from observation to decision. We're not planning, Andrea. We're acting. Call Jackson Moore. Tell him to prep the G800 for immediate departure to Newark Liberty. Then contact our legal team. I want them to prepare for significant FAA fines and potential civil penalties. Andrea's eyes widened as understanding dawned. I'm going to create a teaching moment, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a register that few people ever heard the voice of the military intelligence officer. He had once been the man who had learned that sometimes power needed to be not just held, but demonstrated. Aurora Airlines is about to learn the cost of humiliating my daughter. He moved to his private closet, retrieving the go bag he always kept packed, another habit from his military days. I need you to coordinate with Newark Air Traffic Control. Find out which runway Flight 2237 is scheduled to use for departure. Sir, if you're planning what I think you're planning, the FAA penalties will be astronomical, Andrea cautioned, though her fingers were already moving across her tablet, accessing the information. Money is just money, Dominic replied, shouldering his bag. Dignity is priceless. He paused, considering. Contact the board members individually. Tell them I'm handling a family emergency and that the quarterly review will need to be rescheduled. On the screen behind him, Flight 2237 was preparing for pushback, the jet bridge slowly retracting from the aircraft door. In the terminal, Jade stood alone, her back straight, despite the visible weight of what had just happened to her. Dominic watched his daughter for a moment longer, seeing in her composed stance the same resilience he had cultivated in himself, the ability to endure injustice without being broken by it. But he had promised her something more than endurance. He had promised her a world where she wouldn't need to be quite so strong, quite so prepared for disappointment. One more thing, he said to Andrea as he headed for the door. Contact our PR team. Tell them to prepare for significant media coverage. By this time tomorrow, Aurora Airlines will either be a case study in accountability or a cautionary tale in corporate failure. Their choice. Andrea nodded, already dialing Jackson Moore's number. As the elevator doors closed on Dominic Bennett, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of apprehension and admiration. In 7 years, she had seen him negotiate billion-dollar deals, outmaneuver corporate rivals, and transform industries. But she had never seen him like this. A father with resources, driven by love and righteous anger, about to bring an entire airport to a standstill. On her tablet screen, Flight 2237's status blinked departure imminent. Little did anyone on that aircraft know their journey had already been interrupted before it even began. As Dominic's private car sped toward Teterboro Airport, his mind replayed every conversation he'd ever had with Jade about navigating spaces not designed for her. The careful instructions that no parent should have to give. Don't wear a hoodie in certain neighborhoods. Keep your hands visible in stores. Speak clearly and calmly when questioned by authorities. A memory surfaced from when Jade was just 7 years old, coming home from school in tears, because a teacher had accused her of cheating on a math test. No one could solve those problems that quickly, the teacher had said, refusing to believe that the quiet black girl in the back row could be gifted. Dominic had gone to the school the next day, armed with Jade's previous test scores and the workbooks where she had been solving advanced mathematics problems since age 5. The teacher had apologized, the principal had been embarrassed, and Jade had been moved to an accelerated program. But as he'd driven home with his daughter that day, she had asked a question that still haunted him. "Daddy, what happens when you're not there to make them believe me?" He had promised her then that he would always be there. It was a promise no parent could truly keep. Children grow up, go to college, build lives of their own. Yet in the moments that mattered most, he had tried to honor that commitment, using his resources and position to smooth her path when necessary. But this public humiliation, this casual enforcement of the unspoken rule that his daughter's presence could be questioned anywhere at any time by anyone, this crossed a line he could not allow to stand. His phone rang. It was Jackson Moore, his chief pilot. "The G800 is prepped and ready, sir," Jackson reported. "But there's something you should know. Air traffic control at Newark is reporting significant congestion. There's a weather system moving in from the west that's compressing departures. They're stacking flights for takeoff on runway 4R22L. Dominic processed this information, seeing not a complication but an opportunity. That's the runway flight 2237 will use." "Yes, sir. They're currently 15th in the departure queue." "Perfect," Dominic said, a plan crystallizing in his mind. "File our flight plan as normal. Request priority clearance citing an urgent business matter." There was a brief hesitation on the other end. "Mr. Bennett, I need to be clear about something. If you're planning what I think you're planning, my pilot's license could be at risk." Dominic appreciated the directness. "Jackson, you've been flying for me for 12 years. I'm about to ask you to do something that will likely result in FAA penalties and possibly a temporary license suspension. I will cover any financial consequences, and your position will be waiting for you regardless of outcome. But this is entirely your choice. If you're not comfortable, say so now, and I'll find another way." The pause that followed was filled with the weight of professional ethics being balanced against personal loyalty. Jackson had been with Dominic since the early days of BNS, flying him to investor meetings in a much smaller aircraft when commercial flights weren't an option due to Dominic's punishing schedule. He had watched Jade grow up, had taught her the basics of flight dynamics when she showed an interest in physics. Sir Jackson finally said, "I'll need exact instructions on what you want me to do once we're on the ground at Newark." Dominic smiled grimly. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. "I'll brief you fully when I arrive. For now, just get us clearance to land at Newark instead of Teterboro. Tell them it's a maintenance diversion if necessary." As he ended the call, another one came through, this one from his chief legal counsel, Sophia Reyes. "Dominic, Andrea briefed me on the situation," she began without preamble. "I've pulled up the relevant FAA regulations. Intentionally blocking an active runway carries penalties up to $2 million, possible criminal charges for interference with flight operations, and potential classification as an act of air piracy in extreme cases." "What if the aircraft experiences a mechanical issue that requires it to stop?" Dominic asked. Sophia sighed. "Creating a false emergency is an additional violation. Dominic, I have to strongly advise against this course of action. There are other ways to address what happened to Jade's civil rights complaints, lawsuits, media pressure, all of which would take months or years to resolve," Dominic countered. "By then the message would be clear to my daughter when injustice happens. Trust the system to eventually, maybe possibly, make it right. That's not the lesson I want her to learn today." "And what lesson are you teaching instead?" Sophia challenged their long professional relationship, giving her the freedom to push back. "That rules don't apply if you're rich enough to break them." Dominic considered this as his car approached Teterboro. "No," he said finally. "I'm teaching her that some principles are worth paying for. That dignity has a price, and I'm willing to pay it. That when the system fails, you have to create your own justice." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "I'll prepare the necessary legal responses. And Dominic, For what it's worth, I understand. I just hope the cost isn't higher than you're calculating." As he ended the call, Dominic gazed out at the runway lights of Teterboro Airport glowing in the early afternoon sun. The decision was made. The consequences, whatever they might be, were acceptable. In 23 minutes he had promised Jade. 23 minutes to demonstrate that her dignity was worth fighting for, worth risking for, worth standing ground for. His phone buzzed with a text from Andrea Background, complete on Victoria Aldridge, CEO of Aldridge Consulting luxury brand management firm. Major accounts include Prada Ritz-Carlton and Aurora Airlines. She consulted on their premium customer experience redesign last year. The pieces clicked into place. Victoria Aldridge wasn't just a random entitled passenger. She was part of the corporate ecosystem that had created the very policies and practices that had led to Jade's removal. This wasn't just personal prejudice. It was institutional bias given human form. As his car pulled up to the private aviation terminal, Dominic's resolve hardened. This was no longer just about his daughter. It was about every person who had ever been told explicitly or implicitly that they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. He stepped out of the car, the decision fully crystallized in his mind. Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 would not be departing Newark Liberty International Airport until certain conditions were met. The G800 was about to become both messenger and message. Teterboro Airport's private aviation terminal hummed with the quiet efficiency that caters to the ultra-wealthy. Unlike commercial airports with their security lines and crowded gates, Teterboro offered seamless transitions from car to aircraft privacy and the luxury of departure on one's own schedule privileges. Dominic typically appreciated but rarely thought about. Today, however, the contrast was stark in his mind. Jade had been subjected to public humiliation in a commercial terminal while he enjoyed the insulation of private travel. The disparity crystallized for him a fundamental truth. Money didn't just buy comfort. It bought the ability to avoid certain kinds of indignities entirely. Jackson Moore met him at the terminal entrance, flight bag in hand. At 53, Jackson carried himself with the precise confidence of a former Air Force pilot, close-cropped silver hair, ramrod posture, and eyes that missed nothing. They had flown together for so long that words were often unnecessary between them. "The G800 is fueled and ready," Jackson reported as they walked briskly toward the hangar. "Weather at Newark is clear for the next 3 hours. Flight time is approximately 7 minutes. Dominic nodded. "And the flight plan filed for Newark Liberty with priority clearance approved due to your status with the Port Authority." Jackson hesitated before adding, "I've briefed the crew that this is a non-standard operation. They've been given the option to remain on the ground if they're uncomfortable with the mission parameters." And Dominic asked, genuinely concerned about putting his staff in difficult positions. "They're all in, Jackson, confirmed. Though I think that's more about their loyalty to you and Jade than understanding what we're about to do." They reached the hangar where the gleaming Gulfstream G800 waited, its engines already spooling up for departure. The aircraft was Dominic's latest acquisition, a $78 million testament to BNS's success, capable of flying nearly 8,000 nautical miles without refueling. Today, it would travel less than 20 miles, but its purpose would be no less significant. As they approached the aircraft, Dominic spotted the rest of the flight crew standing at attention near the boarding stairs. Co-pilot Alexis Ramirez, flight engineer Marcus Dupree, and cabin attendant Claire Wilson. All had been with Dominic's aviation team for at least 5 years. All knew Jade personally. "I won't keep you in the dark about what we're doing." Dominic addressed them collectively. "Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 removed my daughter from the aircraft due to discriminatory complaints from another passenger. The airline chose the path of least resistance rather than standing up for what was right. We're going to create a situation where they have to make a different choice." He paused, letting the implications sink in. Specifically, we're going to position this aircraft on runway 4R22L at Newark Liberty, preventing Flight 2237 from taking off until certain conditions are met. This will likely result in FAA violations, fines, and possibly temporary suspension of licenses. I will personally cover all financial penalties and ensure everyone's continued employment regardless of outcome, but I want each of you to make your own decision about participating. The crew exchanged glances, but no one moved away. Alexis Ramirez, the youngest at 34, was the first to speak. "Sir, I met Jade at the company picnic last summer. She helped my daughter with her science project." "We're in." Marcus Dupree nodded in agreement. "Some things matter more than regulations." Claire Wilson simply said, "It's about time someone made a stand." Dominic felt a surge of gratitude for their solidarity, but needed to be absolutely clear. "This isn't without risk. I've consulted with our legal team, and while I'll do everything in my power to protect you all, there could be professional consequences that even I can't mitigate entirely." Jackson checked his watch. "The decision is made, sir. If we're going to intercept Flight 2237 before it departs, we need to be airborne in the next 4 minutes." As they boarded the aircraft, Dominic's phone rang. Andrea calling with an update. "I've been coordinating with our team at Newark," she reported. "Flight 2237 is currently 10th in the departure queue. Estimated takeoff in approximately 22 minutes. I've also spoken directly to the Aurora Airlines CEO, Lawrence Palmer. He's been informed that you're attempting to make contact regarding an urgent matter involving your daughter, but he's in a board meeting and will call back when available." "Perfect," Dominic replied, settling into his seat as the cabin door closed. By the time he's available, he'll have a very different understanding of urgency. He ended the call and turned to Jackson, who was completing his pre-flight checks. "Let's go make history. Or at least the evening news." The engines roared to full power, and the G800 began taxiing toward the runway. As they waited for final clearance for takeoff, Dominic sent one more text to Jade. "Stay where you are. Watch what happens next. Remember this moment." In the cockpit, Jackson received takeoff clearance from Teterboro Tower. Bennett G800 cleared for takeoff runway 19. Contact New York departure on frequency 120. 8 after departure. Cleared for takeoff, runway 19. Bennett G800. Jackson confirmed advancing the throttles. The powerful aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted gracefully into the air, banking toward Newark Liberty International Airport just a few miles away. In less than 7 minutes, they would land. And then the real flight plan would begin, one that would redefine the boundaries of corporate accountability and parental protection in ways that would be studied in business schools and law classes for years to come. As the G800 climbed to its modest cruising altitude of 3,000 feet, Dominic looked out the window at the sprawling New Jersey landscape below. Somewhere down there, his daughter was standing alone in a terminal, the victim of casual discrimination that had been enabled and enforced by corporate policy. The thought steeled his resolve for what was to come. Jackson's voice came over the intercom. 5 minutes to Newark Liberty. "Final approach will begin in 2 minutes." Dominic Bennett closed his eyes briefly, centering himself for the confrontation ahead. When he opened them again, his expression was that of a man who had made peace with consequences, whatever they might be. The bustling terminal seemed to close in around Jade as she stood near gate C12, watching through the large windows as Flight 2237, her flight, completed its final preparations for departure. The jet bridge had retracted and ground crew were removing the last chocks from the aircraft's wheels. Soon it would push back from the gate taxi to the runway and take off for Los Angeles without her. Inside that plane sat Victoria Aldridge, undoubtedly feeling vindicated. The woman had weaponized discomfort, turned her personal prejudice into action, and the system had worked exactly as she'd expected it to, prioritizing her comfort over Jade's dignity. A gate agent approached, tablet in hand. "Miss Bennett, we've rebooked you on Flight 2522 to Los Angeles, departing at 7:15 p.m. I know that's several hours from now, but it was the best we could do given the full flights today." Jade didn't respond immediately, her father's instructions echoing in her mind. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not accept any rebooking." "Miss Bennett," the agent prompted. "I'm not accepting the rebooking," Jade said firmly. "I'll wait for my father. He's on his way here now." The gate agent's expression shifted from professional sympathy to slight impatience. "I understand you're upset, but delaying your rebooking won't change what happened. The 7:15 flight is the best option available." "I appreciate your help," Jade replied, her composure returning with each word. "But I'm declining the rebooking at this time." The agent sighed clearly, wanting to resolve the situation and move on to the next task. "As you wish. The offer will remain available should you change your mind." She walked away, already focusing on her tablet screen. Jade's situation downgraded from immediate problem to pending resolution. Left alone again, Jade found an empty seat with a view of both the gate and the tarmac beyond. She checked her phone. 17 minutes had passed since her father's call. 6 minutes remaining in his promised 23. Her phone had been buzzing continuously with notifications. The video of her removal had already been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms. Classmates were texting asking if she was okay. Her best friend Zuri had called 5 times, leaving increasingly concerned voicemails. The story was spreading digital ripples expanding outward from the point of impact. A text message notification appeared on her screen. "Stay where you are. Watch what happens next. Remember this moment." Her father's words sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. Dominic Bennett was not a man given to dramatic pronouncements without purpose. Jade looked up just as an announcement echoed through the terminal attention passengers. "On Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 to Los Angeles. Your departure will be slightly delayed due to air traffic congestion. We apologize for any inconvenience and will update you with a new departure time shortly." Outside on the tarmac, Flight 2237 had paused its pushback, the tug still attached to its nose gear. Something was happening, something beyond the usual delays that plagued busy airports like Newark. A movement in the sky caught Jade's attention. A sleek private jet with distinctive blue and silver livery was making its final approach to the runway, her father's Gulfstream G800. She recognized it instantly, having flown on it several times for family vacations. But why was it landing at Newark instead of Teterboro, the private aviation airport just a few miles away? As understanding dawned, Jade's eyes widened. "He wouldn't," she whispered to herself, but even as the words left her lips, she knew that he would. Dominic Bennett operated on a different scale of response than most people. Where others might file complaints or seek media attention, he created consequences with the same precision and effectiveness that had built his business empire. Her phone rang Elena Rodriguez, the Hispanic woman who had shown her kindness on the flight. "Jade. This is Elena Rodriguez from the plane. I got your number from another passenger who was filming. Are you all right?" Jade was touched by the concern from this stranger. "I'm okay. Thank you for speaking up for me on the plane." "It was the least I could do," Elena replied, her voice tight with anger. "Listen, something strange is happening. We've been told there's a traffic delay, but the pilot just announced that we're being held at the gate due to runway operations." "Do you know anything about this?" Jade watched as her father's G800 completed its landing and began taxiing not toward the private aviation terminal, but toward the main commercial runways. "I think," Jade said slowly, "that my father is making a point." "Your father?" Elena sounded confused. "What do you mean? My father is Dominic Bennett. He owns Bennett Network Solutions." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. BNS was a household name, its founder frequently featured in business publications and Sunday morning talk shows. The Dominic Bennett. "And he's—" "What exactly is he doing?" Elena asked. Jade watched as the G800 continued its unusual taxi route. I think he's about to show Aurora Airlines that removing me from that flight was the most expensive decision they've made this quarter. Inside Flight 2237, an announcement crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. We've been informed of an unusual situation developing on runway 4R22L, which is causing delays across the airport. We're working with air traffic control to determine when we'll be cleared for departure. We apologize for the inconvenience and will update you as we learn more. Murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers registered the growing delay. Victoria Aldridge, comfortably ensconced in what had been Jade's row, checked her watch with increasing irritation, unaware that her actions had set in motion events that would soon make their way onto national news broadcasts. Back in the terminal, Jade's phone buzzed with another text from her father. Turn on CNN on any airport TV in the next 5 minutes. She looked up, spotting a bank of televisions mounted near a restaurant across from her gate. She walked over just as the screen switched from sports highlights to a breaking news banner developing private jet blocks runway at Newark Liberty International Airport. The helicopter footage showed a sleek Gulfstream aircraft positioned perpendicular across a major runway, effectively preventing any takeoffs or landings. The ticker at the bottom of the screen read, FAA confirms disruption caused by aircraft owned by tech billionaire Dominic Bennett. Motivation unclear at this time. But Jade knew exactly what was happening, and why. Her father had promised her 23 minutes, and true to his word, exactly 23 minutes after their phone call, he had brought one of the busiest airports in America to a standstill, all because Aurora Airlines had valued one passenger's comfort over his daughter's dignity. Her phone rang again. This time, it was her father. "Are you watching?" Dominic asked when she answered. "Dad, I can't believe you did this," Jade said, her voice a mixture of awe and concern. "The FAA is going to. The FAA will find me," he interrupted gently. "Money is just money, Ladybug. But what happened to you today, that was about something money can't fix. Sometimes you have to create a moment so profound that it forces change." Jade watched the continuing news coverage, emotion welling in her throat. "What happens now?" "Now," Dominic replied. "Aurora Airlines has a choice to make. They can acknowledge what happened to you and commit to real change, or they can watch as their entire flight schedule collapses under the weight of one man's determination to protect his daughter." On the television screen, the news anchor was reporting that dozens of flights were now delayed, with the ripple effects potentially impacting air travel across the entire eastern seaboard. All because one father had decided that his daughter's dignity was worth fighting for, not with words, not with lawsuits, but with an unmistakable demonstration of power that couldn't be ignored or delayed or filed away for later consideration. "Stay where you are," Dominic instructed. "This is just beginning." As Jade ended the call, a crowd had gathered around the television screen's passengers from various gates, watching the unfolding drama with a mixture of frustration and fascination. None of them yet realized that the young woman standing quietly among them was the catalyst for the chaos they were witnessing. 23 minutes. Dominic had kept his promise, and now the world was about to learn exactly how far one father would go to right a wrong against his child. Bennett, G800, Newark Tower. You are cleared to land on runway 4L. Jackson acknowledged the clearance as the Gulfstream began its final approach to Newark Liberty International Airport. The aircraft descended smoothly through scattered clouds, the sprawling airport complex growing larger in the windshield. "Gear down," Jackson called, and Alexis confirmed as the landing gear extended with a mechanical whir. Dominic sat in the cabin, monitoring the situation through updates from Andrea. Flight 2237 was still at the gate, delayed by the growing queue of departures ahead of it. The timing was perfect. The G800 would be on the ground and in position before Jade's original flight even began taxiing. The private jet touched down with a gentle chirp of tires meeting asphalt, the thrust reversers engaging briefly to slow their speed. As they exited the active runway, Jackson received their next instructions. Bennett G800 taxi via Alpha to the private aviation terminal. Jackson keyed his microphone. Newark Tower. Bennett G800 requesting special handling. We need to taxi via Bravo to intersect with runway 4R22L for an urgent operational requirement. There was a pause as the controller processed this unusual request from a private aircraft. Bennett G800, say again your request. Did you say you need to taxi to runway 4R22L affirmative Newark Tower? Special operational requirement authorized by... Jackson glanced at Dominic, who nodded and handed him a note. Port Authority Security Protocol B77. There was no such protocol, but Dominic was counting on the controller's uncertainty and the Bennett name's influence to buy them crucial minutes. The BNS security contracts with multiple airports across the country lent just enough plausibility to create hesitation. After a few seconds of silence, the controller responded. Bennett G800, hold position. Stand by for special instructions. Jackson gave Dominic a meaningful look. They're checking. We have maybe 2 minutes before they realize there's no such protocol. Dominic nodded unfazed. 2 minutes is all we need. Proceed to runway 4R22L via the most direct taxiway. Sir, that's a direct violation. I know exactly what it is, Jackson, and I'll take full responsibility. Proceed. Jackson exchanged glances with Alexis, who nodded slightly. They had both already committed to this course of action. Jackson released the brakes and began taxiing not toward the private aviation terminal as instructed, but directly toward runway 4R22L, Newark's main departure runway. Bennett G800, you are deviating from assigned taxi route. Return to taxiway Alpha, immediately. The controller's voice had taken on an edge of alarm. Newark Tower. Bennett G800. Jackson responded calmly. We are experiencing a technical difficulty with our steering mechanism, attempting to resolve. It was a transparent excuse that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, but it created just enough ambiguity to prevent an immediate security response. Aircraft occasionally experienced genuine mechanical issues during taxi operations, unlikely for a brand new G800, but not impossible. As they approached the active runway, Dominic's phone rang. It was Andrea. Sir, Aurora Airlines CEO Lawrence Palmer is on the line. He's demanding to speak with you immediately. Perfect timing, Dominic replied. Put him through. Lawrence Palmer's voice came through tense and accusatory. Bennett, what the hell do you think you're doing? Air traffic control just informed me that your private jet is interfering with operations at Newark. Hello, Lawrence. Dominic replied with deliberate calm. I was hoping to discuss the removal of my daughter from Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 earlier today, but your office indicated you were too busy. I'm glad we found a mutually convenient moment to connect, by disrupting an entire airport. Are you insane? We have 14 flights delayed already. Inconvenient, isn't it? Dominic observed. Being removed from your rightful place through no fault of your own. Having your plans disrupted because someone else decided you don't belong. There was a moment of stunned silence as Palmer registered the parallel Dominic was drawing. Listen to me very carefully. Dominic continued, his voice hardening. Aurora Airlines removed my 17-year-old daughter from a flight today because another passenger, a white woman, decided she didn't want to sit next to her. Your staff chose the path of least resistance, punishing the victim rather than addressing the discrimination. That's not just bad customer service, Lawrence. That's a corporate culture that enables and enforces bias. On the runway ahead, airport vehicles were beginning to gather, their flashing lights visible in the distance. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before security forces would attempt to intercept the aircraft. What exactly do you want? Palmer demanded, calculation replacing anger in his tone. 3 things, Dominic replied as Jackson positioned the G800 precisely in the center of runway 4R22L, perpendicular to the normal flow of traffic, creating a physical barrier that no aircraft could safely navigate around. First, a public acknowledgement of what happened to my daughter and an unequivocal apology. Second, the immediate termination of the staff members involved Thomas Wilson and Melissa Turner. Third, a comprehensive review and revision of your passenger dispute protocols overseen by an independent civil rights organization. You're holding an entire airport hostage over a seating dispute. Palmer sounded incredulous. No, Lawrence. I'm creating consequences for a corporation that allowed my daughter to be publicly humiliated because of her race. The longer we debate this, the more flights will be delayed, the more passengers will be inconvenienced, and the more this story will spread across social media and news outlets. Your choice. As if on cue, a Port Authority vehicle pulled up alongside the G800, lights flashing. A security officer's voice came over the radio. Aircraft on runway 4R22L. This is Port Authority security. Power down your engines immediately and prepare to be boarded. Jackson looked to Dominic for instructions, hand hovering over the engine controls. One moment, Dominic said to both Jackson and Palmer. He pulled up a news app on his phone where coverage of the incident was already breaking. Developing tech, Billionaire blocks Newark Airport runway. After daughter allegedly removed from flight due to racial discrimination. He held the phone to his ear so Palmer could hear the news anchor. Sources at the airport confirmed that Dominic Bennett's daughter, Jade, was removed from Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 after another passenger complained about sitting next to her. Social media videos showing the incident have already been viewed over 500,000 times. The story is out, Lawrence Dominic said. Now you have about 2 minutes to decide, will Aurora Airlines be the company that addressed discrimination directly, or the company that had to be forced into doing the right thing by a father who happened to own a private jet? Your stock price tomorrow depends on your answer now. There was a brief silence. Then Palmer's voice, tight with suppressed fury, but tinged with defeat. Put your demands in writing. I'll have our communications team draft a statement immediately. But Bennett, this isn't over between us. You're right about that. Dominic agreed. This is just the beginning of a long overdue conversation about how your airline treats passengers of color. I look forward to continuing it, perhaps in a congressional hearing about discriminatory practices in the airline industry. I'm sure the Department of Transportation would be fascinated by the data our systems have collected on passenger removal patterns across your fleet. The implied threat hung in the air as Palmer ended the call without further comment. Dominic turned to Jackson. We've made our point. Power down the engines and prepare to cooperate with Port Authority security. Remember, I take full responsibility for everything that's happened here. As the G800's engines spooled down to silence, Dominic looked out the window at the growing number of official vehicles surrounding the aircraft. In the distance, a line of commercial aircraft waited on taxiways, their departures indefinitely delayed by one man's refusal to let injustice pass unchallenged. His phone buzzed with a text from Jade. CNN is showing your plane on the runway. Dad, what have you done? He smiled slightly as he typed his response. Created a teaching moment. Ladybug. Some lessons need to be written in bold letters across the sky. Newark Liberty International Airport erupted into carefully managed chaos as the reality of the situation became clear. The airport's nerve center, its air traffic control tower, buzzed with urgent communications, while digital flight boards throughout the terminals blinked with a cascading series of delays. Attention all aircraft, the senior controller announced over the frequency that all pilots were monitoring Newark Liberty is experiencing a runway incursion on 4R22L. All departures are currently holding position. Arrivals are being redirected to alternate runways where possible or placed in holding patterns. Inside the tower's glass enclosure, Controller Supervisor Michael Ramirez was on the phone with FAA Regional Headquarters, his free hand gesturing emphatically as he spoke. Yes, sir, that's correct. A G800 private jet registered to Bennett Network Solutions has deliberately positioned itself to block the main departure runway. No, sir, not a mechanical failure. The pilot initially claimed steering issues, but it's become clear this is an intentional act. Yes, sir. That Dominic Bennett. Across the airport, the ripple effects were spreading rapidly. In Terminal C, passengers clustered around gate desks, their faces displaying the universal expressions of travel disruption, frustration, resignation, and the particular brand of helpless anger reserved for circumstances beyond one's control. Ladies and gentlemen, announced a harried gate agent at Gate C-17 Aurora Airlines Flight 1422 to Chicago is delayed due to an operational issue on the airfield. We don't currently have an estimated departure time. We appreciate your patience. Similar announcements echoed through Terminals A and B as the domino effect toppled carefully constructed flight schedules across multiple airlines. Each delayed departure meant crews potentially timing out on their FAA-mandated duty limits, connecting passengers missing their next flights and aircraft not being where they needed to be for subsequent journeys. Outside on the tarmac, the scene was even more dramatic. A growing perimeter of Port Authority vehicles surrounded the G800, their emergency lights creating a pulsing blue and red halo around the sleek aircraft. Airport operations vehicles idled nearby their drivers, waiting for instructions that no one seemed prepared to give. Beyond this improvised cordon, commercial aircraft sat immobile on taxiways, their passengers peering out windows at the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. In the Port Authority's command center, Director of Operations Frank Martinez stared at the bank of monitors displaying various angles of the runway blockade, his expression cycling between disbelief and controlled fury. Someone tell me how the hell a private jet managed to position itself perpendicular to our busiest runway without being intercepted, he demanded of his team. We have protocols for exactly this kind of situation, sir, responded his deputy. The aircraft was initially given standard landing clearance. They deviated from their assigned taxi route, claiming a mechanical issue. By the time it became clear this was deliberate, they were already in position, and the pilots still not responding to commands to move the aircraft. He's responding, sir, just not complying. He keeps saying he's experiencing a technical difficulty that prevents movement, but maintenance crews visually confirm there's nothing wrong with the aircraft. It's a deliberate obstruction. Martinez's phone rang his direct line from the Department of Homeland Security. The situation had escalated beyond a mere airport disruption. It was now being treated as a potential security threat. Martinez, he answered tersely. Frank, it's Howard Chen at DHS. We're monitoring the situation at Newark. Is this a security situation we need to engage with or a civil matter? Martinez chose his words, carefully aware of the implications. At this point, we're classifying it as a deliberate, non-violent civil disruption. The aircraft's identity is confirmed as belonging to Dominic Bennett of BNS. There are no indications of terrorist intent or broader security threats. Bennett Chen sounded surprised. The tech CEO. What's his angle here? Initial reports indicate it's related to an incident involving his daughter on an Aurora Airlines flight earlier today. She was removed from the aircraft following a passenger dispute. So he's blocking a runway at a major international airport over a customer service issue. The incredulity in Chen's voice was palpable. That's our current understanding. Port Authority officers are engaging with the aircraft crew now. Bennett is apparently demanding certain actions from Aurora Airlines in exchange for moving his aircraft. Keep me updated, Chen directed. If this extends beyond the next hour, we'll need to reassess the security classification. As Martinez ended the call, a new alert appeared on his screen. News helicopters were approaching Newark airspace requesting permission to cover the developing situation. Deny those requests, Martinez ordered immediately. Last thing we need is live aerial footage encouraging copycats. But it was already too late. Social media was erupting with the story, passengers in the terminals posting photos and videos of the delays, sharing news coverage and speculating about motivations. Runway. Justice and #Bennett blockade were trending nationwide. The story breaking through the usual noise of daily news cycles with the perfect combination of elements: a billionaire's dramatic stand allegations of discrimination and the visual spectacle of a luxury private jet holding an entire airport hostage. Back on runway 4R22L, Port Authority officers had established communication with the G800's crew, but were making little progress in resolving the standoff. The aircraft's door remained sealed, though the engines had been powered down, a gesture of non-aggression that nevertheless left the physical obstruction firmly in place. "This is Port Authority Chief Garcia." To aircraft commander came the authoritative voice over the radio. "You are in violation of multiple federal aviation regulations. Power down all systems and open your door immediately for inspection." Jackson Moore's response was polite but unmovable. "Port Authority, this is Bennett G800. We acknowledge your presence and instructions. We are experiencing a technical difficulty that prevents movement at this time. Our systems are powered down except for essential communications. We will comply with inspection requests once our technical issues are resolved." Inside the G800, Dominic received another update from Andrea. Aurora Airlines CEO Lawrence Palmer has convened an emergency executive team meeting. They're drafting a public statement now. "Flight 2237 remains at the gate, passengers becoming increasingly vocal about the delay." Dominic nodded, glancing at his watch. The standoff had been in effect for 17 minutes, long enough to create significant disruption, but not yet long enough to trigger the most severe emergency protocols. It was a delicate balance, using just enough pressure to force action without crossing the line into territory that might result in serious criminal charges rather than mere civil penalties. "Update our legal team," he instructed Andrea. "Tell them to prepare for FAA fines in the $1.5 to $2 million range, potential criminal charges for interference with air transportation, and civil lawsuits from Aurora Airlines for business disruption." "Already done, sir," Andrea confirmed. They've also prepared preliminary injunctions against any attempt to seize BNS assets pending resolution of the matter. Dominic smiled slightly. His team's efficiency was one of the cornerstones of his success. Even in this unprecedented situation, they were executing with precision. His phone vibrated with a notification. CNN was now covering the story live, with the Chiron tech billionaire blocks airport runway after daughter allegedly faces racial discrimination on flight. The pressure was building exactly as he had calculated. Aurora Airlines now faced a choice: address the underlying issue of discrimination quickly and decisively, or become the company that cared more about operational convenience than confronting bias in its ranks. As if on cue, his phone rang, Lawrence Palmer calling back. The first round of negotiations was about to begin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. I'm afraid I have some unusual news to share. Our departure is being delayed due to an aircraft blocking the primary departure runway. Airport authorities are working to resolve the situation, but at this time we don't have an estimated departure time. We appreciate your patience and will update you as soon as we have more information." The announcement was met with a collective groan from the passengers of Flight 2237, still parked at Gate C12 nearly 40 minutes after their scheduled departure time. Seatbelt signs remained illuminated, cabin doors closed the aircraft fully ready for departure, except for its inability to actually leave the gate. In row 14, Victoria Aldridge shifted impatiently, checking her Cartier watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "This is completely unacceptable," she muttered to no one in particular. "Some of us have important meetings to attend." Across the aisle in row 14, Richard Palmer lowered his newspaper, glancing at Victoria with an expression that had evolved from earlier discomfort to something approaching suspicion. The timing of this delay, coming immediately after the removal of the young black woman, struck him as potentially more than coincidence. "Excuse me," he called to Melissa Turner as she passed through the cabin. "Is there any more specific information about what's causing the delay?" Melissa hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "We're getting updates from the captain as they become available. That's all I can share at this time." But the information vacuum was rapidly being filled by passengers with smartphones and internet access. In row 15, the college student who had recorded Jade's removal was scrolling through Twitter, her eyes widening as she connected the dots. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed loudly enough for nearby rows to hear. "Guys, you need to see this. The runway is being blocked by a private jet belonging to some billionaire named Dominic Bennett. And get this, he's apparently doing it because his daughter was kicked off a flight today due to racial discrimination. Does anyone know which flight that was?" The question hung in the air for only a moment before Elena Rodriguez from row 13 turned around, her expression grim. "This flight." The young woman in the window seat right there, she pointed to what had been Jade's seat now occupied by Victoria's designer handbag, was removed after this lady complained about her. A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers began pulling out phones, searching for more information, finding the rapidly spreading videos of Jade's removal and making the connection to their current predicament. "Wait, so we're stuck here because of what happened to that girl?" asked an older man from row 16. "Not just any girl," the college student corrected, still scrolling. "Jade Bennett, daughter of Dominic Bennett, CEO of Bennett Network Solutions. Net worth over $2 billion. Victoria Aldridge's face, previously flushed with entitled impatience, drained of color as she realized the implications. Her performative discomfort with sitting next to Jade had escalated into a situation far beyond her control, with consequences she hadn't anticipated. "This is absurd," she declared, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "One person cannot simply block an international airport because they're unhappy with airline service. Apparently, if you have your own G800, you can," replied the college student, holding up her phone to display helicopter footage of the private jet positioned across the runway. The atmosphere in the cabin was transforming rapidly. What had been generic travel frustration was evolving into something more focused, a collective realization that their delay was directly connected to an incident many of them had witnessed, but few had challenged. Thomas Wilson, the supervisor who had made the fateful decision to remove Jade, emerged from the cockpit, his face tight with stress. He whispered urgently to Melissa, who nodded and immediately moved toward the aircraft door. "Ladies and gentlemen," came Captain Reynolds's voice again, tension audible despite his professional tone. "I've just been informed that we will be returning to the gate to allow for a change in our departure plans. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." A flight attendant appeared at Victoria's row. "Miss Aldridge, I need you to gather your belongings and come with me, please." Victoria stiffened. "Excuse me, why am I being singled out?" "Aurora Airlines management has requested that you disembark the aircraft. They'll explain the situation inside the terminal." Victoria's face flushed with indignation. "This is outrageous. I'm a platinum member." "Yes, ma'am, we're aware of your status. This decision comes directly from the executive office. Please come with me now." The parallels to Jade's removal less than an hour earlier were impossible to miss the public request, the walk of shame down the aisle. But unlike Jade, Victoria was not maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. She was displaying outrage at being held accountable for her actions. "I will not be treated this way," she declared, remaining firmly seated. "I demand to speak to the airline president immediately." Miss Aldridge, the flight attendant, replied, her patience visibly thinning. "You can either disembark voluntarily, or we can have Port Authority officers escort you off the aircraft. Either way, you will not be continuing to Los Angeles on this flight." A passenger from row 10 called out, "Just leave already. We've been sitting here for almost an hour because of you." Other voices joined in the collective patience of the cabin having reached its breaking point. Victoria looked around, finding no sympathy in the faces surrounding her, only the dawning realization that she had become the villain in a story that was rapidly spreading across social media and news outlets. With as much dignity as she could muster, Victoria collected her belongings, including the luxury handbag that had occupied Jade's seat, and stood. "This is a legal matter now," she announced to no one in particular. "My attorneys will be in touch with Aurora Airlines immediately." No one responded. no one needed to. As Victoria made her way toward the front of the aircraft, passengers openly filmed her exit on their phones, the digital record of her removal already being uploaded to the same platforms that had documented Jade's humiliation. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was on a direct line with Aurora Airlines Operations Control. "Sir, after we remove the passenger as instructed, what's our status for departure? The runway is still blocked." The response from operations was tense. "Stand by for further instructions. The CEO is in direct negotiations with Bennett. Removing Aldridge is step 1 of the resolution process." As Victoria finally exited the aircraft, escorted by both Thomas Wilson and Melissa Turner, whose own futures with the airline were now in serious jeopardy, a sense of grim satisfaction settled over the cabin. Justice, or at least its beginning, was being served not through normal channels of complaint forms and corporate responses, but through the extraordinary leverage of a father with the resources and determination to bring an entire transportation system to a halt. In row 13, Elena Rodriguez was on her phone speaking quietly to Jade, who was still in the terminal. "They just removed her," Elena reported. "The supervisor and flight attendant who kicked you off went with her. The pilot says we're still delayed because of the runway situation, but something's definitely happening." Jade's voice came through subdued but resolute. "My father doesn't make empty gestures. He won't move his plane until he gets everything he's demanding." Which is what exactly Justice Jade replied, simply. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been in my position without having a father who owns a private jet." As Elena ended the call, she looked around the cabin at her fellow passengers. People who had witnessed discrimination in action, but had largely remained silent. Now they were experiencing a fraction of the inconvenience and discomfort that Jade had been subjected to, and it had taken less than an hour for their patience to evaporate. The lesson was not subtle, but perhaps it needed to be exactly that obvious to truly register complacency in the face of injustice eventually costs everyone, not just its immediate victims. In the controlled environment of the G800's cabin, Dominic Bennett sat with perfect posture, his voice calm and measured as he spoke to Lawrence Palmer, CEO of Aurora Airlines, on speakerphone. The contrast between his composed demeanor and the chaos he had created could not have been more stark. "Your aircraft has been removed from our runway for 17 minutes now, Palmer. That's approximately $450,000 in operational losses across the airport, with the number climbing by about $26,000 per minute," Dominic stated, as if reading from a quarterly earnings report rather than calculating the financial impact of his civil disobedience. "How much more would you like to lose before we reach an agreement?" Outside the G800's windows, the flashing lights of Port Authority vehicles created a strobing effect against the aircraft's pristine white fuselage. 6 law enforcement officers stood at a respectful distance, hands resting on holstered weapons, not drawn but visibly present. A mobile staircase had been positioned near the aircraft door, ready for boarding or disembarking as the situation dictated. Palmer's voice crackled through the speaker, tense but controlled. "We've already removed Victoria Aldridge from the flight, Bennett. Thomas Wilson and Melissa Turner have been suspended pending investigation. What more do you want?" "Suspended?" Dominic raised an eyebrow, though Palmer couldn't see the gesture. "That's inadequate. Their actions reflect a corporate culture that prioritizes the comfort of certain passengers over the dignity of others. I want them terminated, effective immediately." "You can't dictate our HR policies," Palmer countered. "There are procedures unions involved." "I'm not interested in your internal constraints," Dominic interrupted. "I'm interested in results. And speaking of results, I still don't see a public statement acknowledging what happened to my daughter." A Port Authority officer approached the aircraft megaphone in hand. "Mr. Bennett, this is Chief Garcia. You have 5 minutes to open your door and surrender control of this aircraft, or we will be forced to take more aggressive measures." Dominic glanced at Jackson, who shrugged slightly. They both knew the threat was largely empty. Forcing entry into the aircraft would create additional safety risks and would generate even more negative publicity for the airport and the airline. It was a bluff designed to accelerate resolution. Your 5 minutes began 3 seconds ago. Chief Garcia Dominic called back through the aircraft's external communication system. I suggest you use them to contact Governor Ramirez and explain why Newark Liberty is making national news for enabling racial discrimination rather than addressing it. The political dimension was calculated to give the authorities pause. Governor Ramirez had built his recent election campaign partly on promises of transportation equity and racial justice initiatives. Being perceived as siding with a corporation against a discrimination claim would be politically costly. Our communications team has drafted a statement, Palmer said, pulling Dominic's attention back to their negotiation. We'll release it within the hour. I want to see it now, Dominic demanded, and it goes live immediately, not within the hour. There was a pause, then the sound of keyboard clicks as Palmer forwarded the draft. Dominic's phone pinged with the incoming email, which he opened and read aloud for the benefit of his crew and the record. Aurora Airlines is aware of an incident on Flight 2237 at Newark Liberty International Airport involving the removal of a passenger following a seating dispute. We take all passenger concerns seriously and are investigating the matter. We apologize for any inconvenience and remain committed to providing excellent service to all customers. Dominic's laugh was sharp and without humor. This is corporate non-communication at its finest, Palmer. No acknowledgement of what actually happened, no mention of discrimination, not even my daughter's name. Try again. What exactly do you want it to say? Palmer's frustration was building, the constraints of corporate legal caution clashing with Dominic's demand for clear accountability. I wanted to say that Aurora Airlines removed Jade Bennett from Flight 2237 due to complaints from another passenger that were rooted in racial bias rather than legitimate concerns. I wanted to acknowledge that your staff chose to enable discrimination rather than confront it. I wanted to outline specific measurable steps you're taking to ensure this never happens again. And I wanted to include the fact that you've terminated the employees responsible and will be implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff. Our legal team will never approve language that explicitly admits to racial discrimination, Palmer objected. The liability exposure would be enormous. Your liability exposure is already enormous, Dominic countered. The videos of my daughter's removal have been viewed over 1 million times in the past hour. #Aurora Airlines is trending nationwide and not in a way that will please your shareholders. Your choice is simple. Acknowledge the truth voluntarily, or have it forced upon you through public pressure and eventual litigation. A new voice joined the conversation, Andrea Martinez, calling in from BNS headquarters. Sir, CNN is reporting that the FAA has declared a ground stop for all Newark operations. Incoming flights are being diverted to JFK, Philadelphia, and Hartford. The estimated financial impact has now reached $1.2 million and climbing. Dominic absorbed this information without visible reaction. Thank you, Andrea. Please continue monitoring the situation. He returned his attention to Palmer. You hear that, Lawrence? $1.2 million in 17 minutes. How much is protecting those 2 employees worth to you? How much is avoiding the words racial discrimination worth to your shareholders? Palmer's sigh was audible through the speaker. I'll have communications redraft the statement with stronger language, but I want your aircraft off that runway the moment it's published. My aircraft moves when I see the statement published on your official channels, when I confirm that Wilson and Turner have been terminated, not suspended, terminated, and when you personally call my daughter to apologize for her treatment on your airline. You're being unreasonable, Palmer protested. No, Lawrence. I'm being a father. There's a difference. Dominic's tone softened slightly. My resources allow me to create consequences that most parents can only dream of when their children are mistreated. But the principle is universal. What happened to Jade today happens to countless people who don't have private jets or billions of dollars. They suffer these indignities silently because corporations like yours have decided that certain people's comfort matters more than others' dignity. Today, that calculation changes. Outside Chief Garcia's 5-minute deadline had passed without action. The standoff continued its resolution, now hinging on words on a screen and the willingness of a corporate executive to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth that his airline had participated in enabled and enforced discriminatory behavior. Dominic's phone pinged with another message from Andrea Aurora Airlines stock, down 3.7% in after-hours trading on news of the incident. Board members beginning to call CEO Palmer directly. The financial pressure was mounting. In the calculus of corporate decision-making, principles often took a back seat to profit margins. Dominic was counting on this reality, using Aurora's own priorities against it. "I'm sending you a revised statement now," Palmer said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. The new draft appeared on Dominic's screen. Aurora Airlines acknowledges that an incident occurred on Flight 22237 at Newark Liberty International Airport, involving passenger Jade Bennett, who was removed from the aircraft following complaints from another passenger. We recognize that this removal was handled inappropriately and that bias may have influenced the decision-making process. We have taken immediate action, including personnel changes and a commitment to reviewing our training and protocols around passenger disputes. We apologize unreservedly to Ms. Bennett for her experience and are taking steps to ensure such incidents do not occur in the future. Dominic read it twice, then shook his head. Still dancing around the central issue, Lawrence. Bias may have influenced. Personnel changes. Number, be direct. Be honest. The truth is your only path forward here. Fine, Palmer snapped. One more revision, but this is it. And I want your word that your aircraft moves the moment this goes live. You have my word, Dominic confirmed. But the statement needs to meet my requirements. 3 minutes later, a third draft arrived. Dominic read it carefully, a small nod of approval gradually forming as he processed the content. Aurora Airlines acknowledges that today, on Flight 2237 at Newark Liberty International Airport, our passenger, Jade Bennett, was wrongfully removed from the aircraft following complaints that were rooted in racial bias rather than legitimate concerns. We recognize that our staff failed to properly address this situation, instead enabling discriminatory behavior. Effective immediately, the employees involved have been terminated, and we are implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing personnel. We apologize unreservedly to Ms. Bennett for the discrimination she experienced on our airline and commit to creating a more inclusive and equitable environment for all passengers. We are engaging independent civil rights experts to review our policies and procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future. This is acceptable, Dominic confirmed after reviewing it thoroughly. Publish it immediately on all channels and I'll order my aircraft to move. It's going live now, Palmer said, defeat evident in his voice. And Bennett. This is far from over between us. Dominic smiled slightly. I would expect nothing less, Lawrence. But whatever comes next, we'll both know that today at least the right thing happened, even if it took a runway blockade to make it happen. As the call ended, Jackson Moore looked to Dominic for instructions. Sir. Are we complying now? Dominic held up one finger, checking his phone as Aurora Airlines' social media accounts simultaneously published the statement. He forwarded it to Jade with a simple message: Justice comes in many forms. This is just the beginning. Then he nodded to Jackson. Power up. We'll comply with Port Authority instructions and accept whatever consequences come next. As the G800's engines began to spool up, Dominic Bennett gazed out at the runway he had commandeered for nearly an hour. The financial cost would be substantial millions in FAA fines, potential criminal charges, civil lawsuits from Aurora Airlines. But as he'd told Palmer, money was just money. His daughter's dignity and, by extension, the dignity of countless others who had faced similar treatment without recourse, that was priceless. Chief Garcia Jackson called over the radio. Bennett G800 is ready to comply with instructions and clear the runway. The standoff was ending, but its ripple effects were just beginning to spread through corporate boardrooms, airport terminals, and social media feeds across the country. A new standard had been set for corporate accountability, forged in the crucible of one father's refusal to accept injustice against his child. We're coming to you live from above Newark Liberty International Airport, where an unprecedented situation has been unfolding for the past hour, announced CNN correspondent Eliza Montgomery, her voice competing with the helicopter's whirring rotors. Tech billionaire Dominic Bennett, founder and CEO of Bennett Network Solutions, deliberately positioned his private jet across the main departure runway, effectively shutting down operations at one of the nation's busiest airports. The aerial footage showed the gleaming G800 now being escorted away from its blockade position by airport vehicles, their flashing lights creating a surreal procession across the tarmac. This extraordinary act of civil disobedience appears to have been triggered by an incident involving Bennett's 17-year-old daughter Jade, who was removed from Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 earlier today. Social media videos show the teenager being escorted off the plane after another passenger, now identified as Victoria Aldridge, CEO of Aldridge Consulting, complained about sitting next to her. The broadcast cut to smartphone footage captured inside the aircraft, showing Jade's dignified exit and Thomas Wilson's uncomfortable expression as he escorted her from the plane. The network had carefully blurred Victoria Aldridge's face, a legal precaution that would be abandoned within hours as her identity became central to the unfolding story. Just moments ago, Aurora Airlines released a statement acknowledging that racial bias played a role in the incident and announcing the termination of the employees involved. Montgomery continued. This statement came after nearly an hour of negotiations between Bennett and Aurora CEO Lawrence Palmer, conducted while Bennett's aircraft remained firmly positioned across runway 4R22L. Inside Terminal C, passengers clustered around television monitors and smartphone screens watching the drama unfold in real time. The story had captured public attention with its perfect storm of elements: racial discrimination, corporate accountability, parental protection, and the spectacle of a billionaire using his resources in such a direct, unprecedented manner. At Gate C12, Jade Bennett stood watching the coverage, her phone buzzing constantly with notifications. The college student who had recorded her removal, now identified as Taylor Reyes, a film major at NYU, had approached her offering solidarity and the original unedited footage. They're calling it #RunwayJustice on Twitter, Taylor told her, scrolling through social media feeds. Your dad is trending worldwide right now. Jade nodded, still processing the enormity of what was happening. Her personal humiliation had been transformed into something larger, a focal point for conversations about discrimination, power, accountability, and the lengths to which a parent would go to protect their child. Her phone rang a FaceTime call from Elena Rodriguez, still aboard Flight 20237. Jade, you won't believe what's happening here, Elena said when Jade answered. They've announced that Victoria Aldridge has been removed from the flight, and the supervisor and flight attendant who kicked you off have been taken off duty. The captain just told us they're waiting for clearance to taxi now that your father's plane is moving. How are the other passengers reacting? Jade asked, genuinely curious about the shift in atmosphere. Everyone's glued to their phones watching the news coverage. It's surreal. Some people who said nothing when you were being removed are now talking about how terrible it was. Amazing how people find their moral compass when there are actual consequences. On major news networks, aviation experts and legal analysts were being hastily assembled for panel discussions about the incident. The commentary ranged from outrage at Bennett's tactics to admiration for his unwavering defense of his daughter. What we're seeing here is unprecedented, declared former FAA Administrator Harold Thompson on MSNBC. The FAA will have no choice but to impose substantial penalties for this deliberate runway incursion. But the bigger conversation is about what drove Bennett to take such extreme action. When a man with that much to lose decides this is his only recourse, it forces us to examine the failures in our aviation system that left him feeling he had no other options. Social media platforms were exploding with activity. Twitter timelines filled with hashtags #Runway Justice, #Fly While Black, #Bennett Blockade, and #Aurora Discrimination. TikTok creators were already producing video analyses, with some reenacting the incident using audio from the original recordings. Instagram stories featured side-by-side comparisons of Victoria Aldridge's removal and Jade's earlier ejection, highlighting the parallel humiliation but contrasting responses. News helicopters from major networks circled Newark at the maximum allowed distance, capturing footage of the G800 being escorted to a remote parking area where Port Authority officers waited to take statements from Dominic and his crew. Inside Aurora Airlines corporate headquarters in Chicago, the communications team was in full crisis mode, monitoring the relentless spread of the story across traditional and social media platforms. Their hastily crafted statement acknowledging racial bias essentially forced from them by Bennett's runway blockade was being dissected word by word, with many commentators noting the unusual directness for corporate communications around discrimination incidents. Aurora Airlines acknowledges that today on Flight 2237 at Newark Liberty International Airport, our passenger Jade Bennett was wrongfully removed from the aircraft following complaints that were rooted in racial bias rather than legitimate concerns. The unambiguous language stood in stark contrast to the typically guarded corporate responses to similar incidents, where phrases like investigating the matter and reviewing the circumstances served as shields against liability. Bennett had successfully forced Aurora to choose between acknowledging an uncomfortable truth and watching their stock price plummet as their operational capacity was held hostage. Back at Newark, Dominic Bennett was now being escorted from his aircraft by Port Authority officers, not in handcuffs, but clearly in custody. News cameras captured his calm demeanor, his expression revealing neither regret nor triumph as he was led to a waiting security vehicle. "Mr. Bennett, do you regret your actions today?" shouted a reporter who had somehow gained access to the tarmac. Dominic paused, turning toward the cameras with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to media attention. "I regret that it was necessary," he replied simply, "but I would do it again tomorrow if faced with the same situation." The clip would be replayed countless times over the following days, becoming one of the defining moments of the incident. A father's unapologetic defense of extraordinary measures taken to protect his child from injustice. As the G800 was secured and Dominic was taken for processing air traffic controllers, began the complex task of resuming normal operations at Newark. The backlog of delayed flights would take hours to clear, affecting thousands of passengers across multiple airlines and creating ripple effects throughout the national air transportation network. Yet, amid the chaos and disruption, a significant shift had occurred in how one major corporation would approach issues of bias and discrimination moving forward. Whether out of genuine moral awakening or pragmatic risk management, Aurora Airlines had been forced to confront an uncomfortable reality that sometimes the cost of enabling discrimination far exceeded the cost of addressing it directly. On social media, a new hashtag was beginning to gain traction alongside the others. What if everyone had? Yet a poignant question about access to justice in a world where most people facing discrimination had no runway to block, no leveraged negotiations to force no billionaire father to create consequences that corporations couldn't ignore. It was this question that would ultimately transform a personal stand into a broader movement for accountability in the days and weeks to come. The conference room at Newark Liberty's Port Authority offices had been hastily repurposed for the most unusual negotiation in the airport's history. Dominic Bennett sat on one side of the polished table, his posture relaxed despite the gravity of the situation. Across from him sat Lawrence Palmer, CEO of Aurora Airlines, his face tight with controlled fury, flanked by the airline's general counsel and head of operations. Between them on the table was a speakerphone connecting them to the FAA's regional director, the airport's operations chief, and Aurora's board chairman. The air in the room was charged with tension, the stakes measured in millions of dollars and thousands of disrupted travel plans. Let me be perfectly clear. Palmer began leaning forward with his hands clasped before him. What you've done today, Bennett, is not activism or advocacy, it's criminal. You've deliberately interfered with air transportation, violated multiple federal aviation regulations, and caused my airline alone over $4 million in losses, not to mention the broader impact across the industry. Dominic nodded slightly, acknowledging the factual accuracy of the statement without conceding its moral implications. And let me be equally clear, Palmer. What your airline did today, removing my daughter from a flight based on another passenger's racially motivated complaints, is discrimination. The only difference is that your actions are technically legal, while mine are technically illegal. But we both know which one is right and which one is wrong. The FAA regional director's voice crackled through the speakerphone. Mr. Bennett, regardless of your motivations, the FAA is prepared to impose the maximum civil penalty of $1.84 million for deliberate runway incursion. Your pilot, Jackson Moore, faces license suspension of no less than 12 months. These are not negotiable consequences. I understand and accept those penalties, Dominic replied without hesitation. As I told Mr. Palmer earlier, money is just money. My daughter's dignity is priceless. Palmer's general counsel, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, interjected. We should also note that Aurora Airlines is preparing civil litigation for business interruption and reputational damage. Our preliminary assessment suggests damages well in excess of $10 million. Dominic smiled slightly. And my legal team is preparing a civil rights lawsuit regarding my daughter's treatment with punitive damages that could easily reach $50 million. Shall we continue escalating theoretical legal threats, or would you prefer to discuss actual solutions? The airport operations chief spoke next. Gentlemen, while these matters will ultimately be resolved in court, our immediate concern is restoring normal operations. The ground stop has now been lifted, but we're facing a backlog of over 80 flights. We need to focus on practical next steps. Dominic nodded, his expression shifting to one of pragmatic business focus. I agree. My aircraft has been moved. The statement acknowledging what happened to my daughter has been published. The employees responsible have been terminated. Those were my 3 conditions, and they've been met. Under duress, Palmer muttered. Under pressure, Dominic corrected. The same pressure my daughter felt when she was publicly humiliated for simply existing in a space she had every right to occupy. Aurora's board chairman spoke for the first time, his tone measured. Mr. Bennett, while none of us condone the methods you employed today, I believe we can all acknowledge that this incident has exposed weaknesses in Aurora's passenger dispute protocols. Our statement commits us to addressing these issues. Can we take your word that there will be no further direct action on your part? Dominic considered the question carefully before responding. My actions today were specific to the immediate situation involving my daughter. I have no plans for further disruptions of airport operations. However, he added, his gaze fixed firmly on Palmer. I will be watching Aurora's follow-through on its commitments very carefully. Your statement promised meaningful change. I expect to see it. Palmer bristled visibly. You're in no position to make demands. On the contrary, Dominic replied calmly. I'm in precisely the position to make demands. You saw today what one man with resources can do when provoked by injustice. Imagine what thousands of affected passengers could do if properly organized and supported. The implied threat hung in the air, not of further runway blockades, but of something potentially more damaging to Aurora coordinated legal and public relations action from multiple discrimination victims backed by Bennett's considerable resources and influence. "This ends today." Bennett Palmer said, his voice low but intense. "Your runway or your reputation, choose one." Dominic leaned forward, matching Palmer's intensity. "That's where you're wrong, Lawrence. This doesn't end today. This is just the beginning. What happened to Jade happens to people without private jets every day on your airline and others. The difference is that today someone finally had the means to create consequences you couldn't ignore." He stood straightening his jacket with deliberate calm. "My attorneys will be in touch regarding the FAA penalties. I'll be paying those personally, not through BNS corporate accounts. As for Aurora's threatened litigation, you might want to consult with your shareholders before proceeding. Your stock is already down nearly 5% in after-hours trading. How much more can they afford to lose over a principled stand against accountability?" Palmer remained seated, seething silently as Dominic prepared to leave. "One more thing," Dominic added, pausing at the door. "My daughter is still planning to attend the CalTech summer program she was traveling to. I expect Aurora to provide her with first-class transportation on the next available flight, with your personal assurance that she'll be treated with the dignity every passenger deserves." "You can't be serious," Palmer sputtered. "After all this, you expect us to—" "It's called accountability, Lawrence," Dominic interrupted. "You acknowledge that your airline wrongfully removed my daughter due to racial bias. The logical next step is making it right by getting her to her destination as originally planned. Unless, of course, your statement was just empty words forced from you by circumstance rather than conviction." The airport operations chief cleared his throat awkwardly. "If I may suggest, a private charter might be more appropriate given the heightened emotions surrounding this incident." "No," Dominic said firmly. "Jade will fly Aurora Airlines as originally ticketed. Not because it's convenient, but because it's right. She did nothing wrong, and she shouldn't have to alter her plans because of someone else's prejudice." He looked directly at Palmer, his expression softening slightly. "This isn't personal, Lawrence. It's principles. Today it was my daughter on your airline. Tomorrow it could be your daughter on someone else's. The question isn't what kind of CEO you want to be, but what kind of world you want her to live in." With that, Dominic left the room, the door closing quietly behind him. In the silence that followed, the weight of his words settled over the assembled executives. Personal animosity and corporate damage control gradually gave way to uncomfortable reflection on the underlying truth that what had happened to Jade Bennett was wrong, and that it had taken extraordinary measures to force that simple acknowledgement. As the meeting disbanded, Palmer remained alone in the conference room, staring at the company statement displayed on his tablet. The words he had resisted, then reluctantly approved, now confronted him with their undeniable truth. Our passenger, Jade Bennett, was wrongfully removed from the aircraft following complaints that were rooted in racial bias rather than legitimate concerns. We recognize that our staff failed to properly address this situation, instead enabling discriminatory behavior. For the first time since the crisis began, Lawrence Palmer considered the possibility that Dominic Bennett's actions, while extreme and legally questionable, might ultimately force necessary change, not just within Aurora Airlines, but across an industry that had too often prioritized operational convenience over fundamental human dignity. Outside normal operations were slowly resuming at Newark Liberty International Airport. Aircraft were taking off and landing. Passengers were boarding and deplaning, the complex choreography of commercial aviation gradually returning to its familiar rhythms. But beneath this apparent return to normalcy, something had shifted. A precedent had been set, a message had been sent, and a father had demonstrated what truly mattered to him in the most unambiguous way possible. The confrontation had reached its peak and was now resolving, but its echoes would reverberate far beyond the confines of that conference room, that airport, that day. A new standard for corporate accountability had been established not through regulation or legislation, but through one man's refusal to accept his daughter's mistreatment without consequence. 48 hours after Dominic Bennett's G800 blocked runway 4R22L at Newark Liberty International Airport, Lawrence Palmer stood at a podium in Aurora Airlines corporate headquarters in Chicago, facing a room packed with journalists from every major news outlet. Camera shutters clicked in rapid succession as he cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and began to read from the prepared statement. 2 days ago, an incident occurred on Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 that has since gained national attention. A young woman, Jade Bennett, was removed from our aircraft following complaints from another passenger. After thorough investigation and reflection, we have confirmed that this removal was not justified and was influenced by bias rather than legitimate safety or operational concerns. Palmer paused, taking a sip of water from the glass beside him. His hands trembled slightly, the only visible sign of the internal struggle between corporate self-preservation and genuine accountability. Aurora Airlines accepts full responsibility for this failure. We failed Ms. Bennett. We failed to uphold our own stated values of inclusion and respect. We failed to properly train and oversee our staff in handling passenger disputes equitably. For these failures, we offer our unreserved apology, particularly to Ms. Bennett, but also to all our passengers who deserve better. In a hotel suite across town, Dominic and Jade Bennett watched the press conference on a large screen, their expressions revealing nothing as Palmer continued. Effective immediately, we are implementing the following changes. First, we have terminated the employment of the staff members directly involved in this incident. Second, we are instituting mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing employees to be completed within 90 days. Third, we are revising our passenger dispute protocols to include explicit safeguards against discriminatory complaints being used as grounds for passenger removal. The cameras captured Palmer's face in high definition as he announced the next measure, the one that had been most fiercely debated in Aurora's emergency board meetings. Fourth, we are establishing an independent review board comprising civil rights experts and customer advocates who will have oversight of all passenger removal incidents to ensure fairness and accountability. And finally, we are creating a new executive position, Chief Inclusion Officer, who will report directly to me and have authority to implement structural changes throughout our organization. In newsrooms across the country, editors were already preparing headlines. Aurora Airlines announces major overhaul following discrimination incident and Bennett blockade forces. Airline accountability. To demonstrate our commitment to these changes, Palmer continued, we have invited Jade Bennett to return to Aurora Airlines as our guest on any flight of her choosing, and we have extended a formal invitation to Dominic Bennett to serve as a special advisor to our board on matters of customer equity. In their hotel suite, Dominic raised an eyebrow at this unexpected offer, a strategic olive branch designed to transform an adversary into an ally. Jade glanced at her father, curious about his reaction to this corporate maneuver. While we cannot undo what happened to Ms. Bennett, Palmer concluded, we can ensure that her experience creates lasting positive change within our company, and we hope across the airline industry. We are committed to becoming an example of how corporations should respond when confronted with evidence of bias in their operations, not with denial or minimization, but with honesty, accountability, and concrete action. As Palmer finished his statement and prepared to take questions from the assembled press, his phone vibrated in his pocket with a text message from Aurora's head of communications. Bennett just accepted the advisory role. Terms being finalized now. It was the first piece of good news Palmer had received since the crisis began. Aurora's stock had stabilized following the initial drop, and early social media reaction to the press conference was cautiously positive. The corporate surrender, when executed with appropriate contrition and concrete commitments, was beginning to look more like corporate transformation. Meanwhile, in Newark, Victoria Aldridge was experiencing a different kind of fallout. Her company, Aldridge Consulting, had placed her on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Major clients, including Prada and the Ritz-Carlton, had quietly suspended their contracts, concerned about association with the now viral face of travel discrimination. Her carefully constructed professional image had crumbled in the face of smartphone footage showing her true character in an unguarded moment. In the departure lounge of Gate C-12, the same gate where Jade had stood alone 2 days earlier, passengers preparing to board another Aurora Airlines flight were discussing the changes announced at the press conference. "You think anything will really change?" asked an elderly man to his wife as they waited to board. "I don't know," she replied thoughtfully. "But when's the last time you saw a company admit to racism this directly? Usually it's all we regret if anyone felt uncomfortable nonsense. That's because they don't usually have someone park a G800 across their runway," her husband pointed out pragmatically. Money talks. No countered a young woman who had been listening nearby. It wasn't just money. It was love. A father who wouldn't let his daughter be treated that way and had the means to do something about it. That evening, as Aurora Airlines implemented the first wave of its promised changes, Jackson Moore received official notice from the FAA. His pilot's license was suspended for 12 months, effective immediately. The letter arrived at his home alongside a second envelope, this one from Bennett Network Solutions, containing confirmation of his promotion to Director of Aviation Operations, a position that would allow him to oversee the company's fleet during his suspension with no reduction in salary or benefits. Melissa Turner and Thomas Wilson, the flight attendant and supervisor who had removed Jade from Flight 2237, received no such safety net. Their termination packages included standard severance but explicitly cited failure to uphold company values and enabling discriminatory behavior as grounds for dismissal. Both would struggle to find comparable positions within the industry, their names now associated with a case study in poor judgment that would be taught in corporate training sessions for years to come. At CalTech, preparations were being finalized for Jade's arrival. The summer quantum computing program coordinators had reached out personally, expressing their excitement to welcome her and their support following the widely publicized incident. What might have been an anonymous arrival was now accompanied by a certain notoriety not of Jade's choosing, but perhaps ultimately to her benefit in building the resilience necessary for a young black woman entering elite STEM spaces. In the corporate offices of Bennett Network Solutions, Andrea Martinez was coordinating with legal teams handling the FAA fines $1.84 million for the runway incursion paid personally by Dominic without complaint. The sum, substantial to most, represented less than 0.1% of his net worth, a small price for the message it had sent and the changes it had catalyzed. As twilight settled over Chicago, Dominic and Jade sat in their hotel suite reviewing Aurora's formal advisory board offer. The position would give Dominic significant influence over the airline's equity initiatives without the legal liabilities of directorship, a carefully crafted compromise that served both parties' interests. "What do you think?" Dominic asked his daughter, valuing her perspective on a situation that had after all begun with her mistreatment. Jade considered the question carefully. "I think it's smart," she finally said. "They need your expertise, but more importantly, they need to show they're serious about change. Having you involved gives them credibility they couldn't buy with advertising." Dominic nodded, pleased with her analysis. "And for us?" "For you, it's a platform to create change beyond just Aurora. For me?" She paused, looking out at the Chicago skyline, glittering against the darkening sky. "For me, it's knowing that what happened wasn't for nothing, that something good came from it." Dominic signed the agreement, his distinctive signature flowing across the paper with the same confidence that had characterized his unprecedented stand. Aurora Airlines had surrendered, but in doing so had perhaps found a path to becoming something better than it had been before, an outcome that served everyone's interests, from shareholders to passengers to the Bennett family themselves. The corporate surrender was complete. the corporate transformation was just beginning. A light rain fell at Newark Liberty International Airport as Dominic Bennett's town car pulled up to Terminal C's departures level. 3 days had passed since his aircraft had blocked runway 4R22L. 3 days of intense negotiations, media coverage, and corporate restructuring at Aurora Airlines. Now he was returning to the scene where it all began, not as a protester or disruptor, but as a father accompanying his daughter on her rescheduled journey to Los Angeles. Jade sat beside him in the back seat, her expression thoughtful as she gazed at the terminal entrance. She wore a simple outfit, jeans, sneakers, and a different CalTech sweatshirt than the one she'd worn during her original attempt to fly, but carried herself with a new awareness of her place in the world. Nervous Dominic asked quietly. Jade considered the question before answering. Not nervous, just different. 3 days ago, I was just another passenger. Now you're Jade Bennett. Dominic completed the thought. The catalyst for change. The driver opened their door and they stepped out into the light rain. Unlike Jade's first departure attempt, there was no anonymity this time. Heads turned as they entered the terminal, recognition flickering across faces. Smartphones discreetly raised to capture images of the father-daughter pair whose confrontation with Aurora Airlines had dominated news cycles. They were immediately approached by Jennifer Garcia, Aurora's newly appointed Vice President of Customer Experience, who had been waiting for their arrival. Mr. Bennett, Ms. Bennett. She greeted them with professional warmth. Thank you for giving Aurora Airlines the opportunity to make things right. We have a private lounge prepared for you, and I'll personally escort you to the aircraft when it's time to board. Dominic nodded, accepting the courtesy without comment. The special treatment was not what he had fought for. Rather, it was the principle that all passengers should be treated with dignity, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. But he recognized the symbolic importance of Aurora's public demonstration of respect for his daughter. As they followed Garcia through the terminal, a middle-aged black woman approached them, briefly touching Jade's arm to get her attention. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I just wanted to say thank you. My daughter flies alone to visit her father every month, and she's been nervous ever since she was questioned about her ticket last year. What your father did, it means something to us." Jade smiled, genuinely moved by the woman's words. "Thank you for telling me that." Similar moments occurred as they made their way through the terminal, not a crowd or commotion, but individual expressions of solidarity and gratitude. A Hispanic TSA agent made eye contact with Dominic and gave a subtle nod of respect. An elderly white couple whispered to each other as the Bennetts passed the woman smiling encouragingly at Jade. In the private lounge, father and daughter finally had a moment alone. The space was elegant, but impersonal standard corporate luxury designed to communicate status rather than comfort. Through the large windows, they could see aircraft taking off and landing the same runways that had been disrupted by Dominic's extraordinary act of protest. Dad Jade said after a period of comfortable silence, "I've been thinking about what you did, about the consequences. The FAA fines, Jackson's license suspension." Dominic turned to face his daughter fully, giving her his complete attention. "Was it worth it?" She asked the question, simple but profound. Dominic considered his answer carefully, understanding its importance. "There's a calculation most people make when faced with injustice," he began. "They weigh the cost of fighting against the cost of accepting it. For most people, fighting seems too expensive, too risky. They don't have runways to block or millions to spare in fines. So they absorb the injustice, carry it with them, let it accumulate like interest on a debt they never agreed to take on." He paused, choosing his next words with precision. "I had the rare privilege of being able to make a different calculation. The fine was substantial but affordable. Jackson's suspension is being managed. My reputation has probably improved in some circles and suffered in others. But none of that compares to the cost of letting you believe even for a moment that what happened was acceptable or that you were alone in facing it." Jade nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. But most people don't have that choice. Exactly, Dominic agreed. Which is why those of us who do have a responsibility to use it. Not just for ourselves or our children, but for everyone who shares their experience without sharing their resources. They sat together, father and daughter, united not just by blood, but by a shared understanding of privilege and responsibility, of justice and accountability, of love expressed through action rather than words alone. Their moment of reflection was interrupted by Jennifer Garcia's return. Ms. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, your flight is ready for boarding. We'll be using a private entrance to the aircraft. As they followed Garcia through a service corridor that would allow them to board without passing through the general gate area, Dominic noticed his daughter's slight frown. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. "This," Jade gestured at their private path. "It solves the wrong problem. The issue wasn't that I needed special treatment. It was that I needed equal treatment." Dominic smiled, pride evident in his expression. "Perhaps you should mention that to Ms. Garcia." Jade considered this, then stopped walking. "Ms. Garcia," she called, causing the Aurora executive to turn around expectantly. "I appreciate the courtesy, but I'd prefer to board through the regular gate just like any other passenger. That's all I wanted 3 days ago, to be treated like everyone else. Not better, not worse." Garcia seemed surprised by the request, but quickly recovered. "Of course, Ms. Bennett. We can certainly accommodate that preference." They changed direction, heading back toward Gate C12, the same gate where Jade had been removed from Flight 2237 3 days earlier. As they approached, Jade squared her shoulders, ready to reclaim the space from which she had been unjustly ejected. The gate area was crowded with passengers waiting for Aurora Airlines Flight 2237 to Los Angeles. The same flight number, the same route, a symbolic decision by Aurora to demonstrate their commitment to righting the wrong that had occurred. As the Bennetts appeared, a ripple of recognition passed through the waiting travelers. Then something unexpected happened. A young Asian woman stood up from her seat, made eye contact with Jade, and began to applaud. Slowly, others joined in, first a few, then dozens, until most of the gate area was offering a spontaneous show of support. It wasn't orchestrated or planned. It was a genuine moment of human connection, of collective acknowledgement that something wrong had been confronted and addressed. Jade stood still, momentarily overwhelmed by the unexpected response. Dominic placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, his presence steady and reassuring as always. When the applause subsided, boarding began normally. Jade presented her boarding pass, received the standard scanning beep of confirmation, and walked down the jet bridge toward the aircraft that would finally take her to California. Dominic followed a few steps behind, allowing his daughter to lead the way to reclaim her journey on her own terms. As they settled into their first-class seats, Aurora had upgraded them despite Dominic's insistence that it wasn't necessary. Jade looked out the window at the busy tarmac where her father's G800 had made its historic stand. "You know what's strange," she said softly. 3 days ago, all I wanted was to be invisible, to blend in, not cause problems, just get to CalTech without anyone noticing me. Now you've been seen, Dominic, completed, really seen, for exactly who you are." Jade nodded, a smile slowly spreading across her face. "I think I like it better this way." As the aircraft began its pushback from the gate, Dominic Bennett watched his daughter gazing out the window, her reflection revealing a young woman transformed not by victimhood, but by vindication, not by the injustice she had faced, but by the justice that had followed. In that moment, all the fines, all the legal complications, all the media scrutiny seemed insignificant compared to the simple truth reflected in Jade's expression. She knew without doubt that she mattered, that her dignity was worth fighting for, and that she would never have to face injustice alone. The reunion had come full circle, returning them to the journey that had been interrupted. But they were continuing it as changed people. Jade with a deeper understanding of her worth, Dominic with the satisfaction of having kept his most important promise to his child. As the aircraft lifted into the cloudy New Jersey sky, father and daughter settled into a comfortable silence, bound by love, respect, and the shared experience of having stood their ground when it mattered most. The autumn sun cast a golden glow over Newark Liberty International Airport as Jade Bennett stood on the observation deck gazing out at the bustling tarmac where aircraft arrived and departed in carefully choreographed sequence. 2 years had passed since the day her father's Gulfstream G800 had blocked runway 4R22L, transforming a personal humiliation into a catalyst for industry-wide change. At 19, Jade had matured beyond her years, the experience having accelerated her evolution from brilliant but cautious teenager to confident young woman with a clear sense of purpose. Her quantum computing research at CalTech had expanded into groundbreaking work on algorithmic bias detection, earning her recognition far beyond her years. The temporary notoriety of being the girl from the runway incident had gradually been replaced by professional respect for her academic contributions. Reddy asked her father, joining her at the railing. At 47, Dominic Bennett carried himself with the same quiet authority that had built a tech empire and challenged an airline industry, though recent years had softened the intensity that once defined him. His corporate focus had shifted significantly with the Bennett Initiative for Travel Equity, now commanding as much of his attention as Bennett Network Solutions. Jade nodded, checking her watch. "The ceremony starts in 30 minutes. We should head down." Together they made their way through the terminal toward a section that had been cordoned off for the day's event. A banner stretched across the entryway, "Official Dedication, the Bennett Terminal for Equitable Transportation." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. 2 years after Dominic had been escorted from this same airport in quasi-custody, a terminal was being named not for his corporate philanthropy or technological innovations, but for his act of civil disobedience and the reforms it had catalyzed. The dedication ceremony had drawn an unusual mix of attendees, airline executives, civil rights leaders, transportation regulators, airport staff, and ordinary travelers who had experienced the impact of the industry's transformation. Aurora Airlines CEO Lawrence Palmer was present, their former adversarial relationship having evolved into a pragmatic partnership focused on industry reform. Jackson Moore, Dominic's pilot who had participated in the runway blockade, stood nearby in his captain's uniform, having fully resumed his flying duties following his license suspension. As the ceremony began, Port Authority Director Frank Martinez approached the podium. 2 years ago, an unprecedented incident occurred at this airport, one that initially appeared to be simply a security breach and operational disruption. What we didn't realize then was that it would become the catalyst for the most significant transformation in passenger rights protection in aviation history. The audience listened attentively as Martinez continued. The Bennett Terminal for Equitable Transportation isn't just a renamed facility. It's a physical embodiment of our commitment to ensuring that every passenger, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or appearance, receives equal dignity and consideration in our transportation systems. The terminal renovations went far beyond symbolic gestures. New training facilities for staff focused on equitable conflict resolution. Digital information kiosks displayed real-time data on passenger removal statistics across demographic categories. A dedicated passenger advocacy office provided immediate assistance for travelers experiencing potential discrimination. The physical space itself had been redesigned to create more inclusive environments, replacing the subtle hierarchies embedded in traditional terminal layouts with architecture that emphasized equal access and dignity for all travelers. When it came time for the Bennetts to speak, Dominic surprised the audience by stepping aside. "Today, we'll hear not from me, but from the person whose experience started this journey, my daughter Jade." Jade approached the podium with composed confidence, surveying the gathered crowd before beginning her remarks. 2 years ago, I stood in this airport as a 17-year-old who had just been publicly humiliated for daring to occupy a space someone else decided I didn't belong in. Today I stand here as a researcher, a student, and a reluctant symbol of what can happen when discrimination is confronted rather than accommodated. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. The changes we're celebrating today aren't about special treatment or exceptional circumstances. They're about creating systems where dignity isn't a privilege allocated based on appearance or assumptions, but a baseline expectation for everyone who enters our transportation networks. Throughout the terminal, travelers paused their journeys to listen to the ceremony broadcast over the public address system, an unusual interruption to the typical airport announcements about gate changes and security protocols. The most important legacy of what happened here isn't this renamed terminal, or even the specific policies that have been implemented, Jade continued. It's the fundamental shift in how we think about belonging in public spaces. The question is no longer whether certain people have the right to occupy certain seats, but how we ensure that right is protected equally for everyone. As Jade concluded her remarks, the ceremony transitioned to the official unveiling of the terminal's new signage. Dominic and Jade stood together as the covering was removed, revealing the name that would greet millions of travelers in the years to come. Following the ceremony, as attendees mingled during the reception, Lawrence Palmer approached the Bennetts. The Aurora Airlines CEO had undergone his own transformation from reluctant crisis manager to vocal advocate for industry reform. "You know," Palmer said to Dominic when we were negotiating during the runway standoff, "I told you this wasn't over between us. I never imagined it would end with us collaborating on the most significant restructuring of passenger rights in aviation history." Dominic nodded, acknowledging the remarkable evolution of their relationship. Sometimes adversaries make the most effective partners. We each brought different perspectives to the same fundamental goal. Nearby, Victoria Aldridge's name was mentioned in a conversation between industry observers, discussing the case study being taught at Harvard Business School about the incident and its aftermath. Her story had become a cautionary tale of reputation destruction in the digital age. Her consulting firm dissolved her client list, evaporated her professional identity permanently linked to that moment of exposed prejudice. Yet the final resolution wasn't about individual victories or defeats, but about the structural changes that had permanently altered how commercial transportation operated. The Bennett Protocol had been adopted by every major airline in the United States and was being implemented by carriers in Europe, Asia, and Australia. The Department of Transportation's Passenger Rights Framework, inspired by recommendations from the Bennett Initiative, had created legally binding standards for equitable treatment across all transportation modes. Most significantly, the data told a compelling story of transformation. Discriminatory removal incidents had decreased by 94% across all major carriers. Customer satisfaction scores had improved across all demographic categories. Airlines that had most fully embraced the equity initiatives were showing improved operational efficiency and reduced legal expenses related to passenger disputes. The economic case for equity had been definitively established, removing the perceived tension between moral imperatives and business interests that had previously slowed progress on addressing discrimination in commercial settings. As the day's events concluded and visitors dispersed, Jade and Dominic took a final walk through the terminal that now bore their name. Around them, travelers moved through spaces designed with a new consciousness about dignity and belonging, a physical manifestation of the principle that had been worth fighting for 2 years earlier. "Dad," Jade said as they paused near the central atrium, "do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't blocked that runway?" Dominic considered the question thoughtfully. "Sometimes. But what I think about more is how many people experienced what you did without having anyone who could create consequences powerful enough to force change." Jade nodded, understanding the privilege and responsibility implied in his answer. "That's why the algorithm matters," she said, referring to her bias detection system now being implemented across multiple industries. "It creates accountability that doesn't depend on having a father with a private jet." As they prepared to leave the airport, an arriving passenger approached them. A young black woman traveling alone, recognition dawning on her face as she realized who they were. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I just wanted to thank you both. I fly frequently for work, and the difference in how I'm treated now compared to 2 years ago it's remarkable. Something fundamental has changed." It was these moments more than the named terminal or policy reforms or legal precedents that constituted the true legacy of what had begun as a father's refusal to accept his daughter's humiliation without response. The runway blockade had been extraordinary, precisely because most people facing discrimination lacked such powerful means of creating consequences. The lasting impact lay in the structures now ensuring that such extraordinary measures wouldn't be necessary for others to receive the dignity and respect they deserved. As Dominic and Jade Bennett left Newark Liberty International Airport that evening, they carried with them the knowledge that their personal stand had expanded far beyond its original context to create protection for countless others who would never need to know their names to benefit from their actions. The final resolution wasn't about one incident or one family or even one industry, but about a recalibration of expectations about how people should be treated in shared spaces, not as a matter of privilege or exception, but as a fundamental right guaranteed by both moral principle and structural accountability. The pristine white laboratory at MIT's Quantum Computing Research Center hummed with the quiet energy of breakthrough science. Advanced equipment lined the walls while holographic displays projected complex equations and circuit diagrams in the center of the room. Standing amidst this technological marvel, 21-year-old Jade Bennett guided her team through the final adjustments to the system they had spent the past year developing. "The neural mapping sequence is stable," she confirmed, analyzing the data streaming across her display. "Let's initiate the bias detection protocol on the test dataset." 3 years after the incident that had briefly defined her in the public consciousness, Jade had fully emerged from the shadow of that moment to establish herself as a pioneering researcher in her own right. Her acceptance to MIT's undergraduate program had been followed by unprecedented achievements, publishing her first peer-reviewed paper as a freshman, receiving the prestigious Thornton Fellowship for Innovation in Computing Ethics, and now leading a research team despite still being an undergraduate. Her work focused on the intersection of quantum computing and ethical algorithm design, specifically creating systems capable of identifying and mitigating bias in decision-making frameworks. What had begun as a personal response to injustice had evolved into groundbreaking research with applications across multiple industries. Sequence Complete announced one of her team members, a graduate student 5 years her senior. Detection accuracy at 99.7% with only 0.2% false positives, 2% false. Jade nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. The algorithm they had developed represented a significant advancement in bias detection technology capable of identifying potential discrimination nodes within complex decision systems before they manifested in real-world outcomes. Later that evening in her campus apartment, Jade reviewed the final draft of her paper for the International Journal of Ethical Computing. As she worked, a notification appeared on her screen, the Bennett Initiative for Travel Equity's quarterly impact report, showing continued decreases in discriminatory incidents across all major transportation providers. Her phone rang her father, calling for their weekly check-in. "The test run was successful," she reported when she answered. "We're submitting the final paper tomorrow. Congratulations." Dominic replied, his pride evident even through the digital connection. "How does it feel to be revolutionizing ethical computing before you've even graduated?" Jade laughed softly. "Says the man who revolutionized an entire industry by parking a private jet across a runway." Their shared humor about the incident reflected how both had integrated that extraordinary moment into their identities without being defined by it. For Jade, it had become the catalyst for her research focus, rather than the central narrative of her life. The Scholarship Foundation Review Committee meets next week. Dominic mentioned shifting topics. 27 applications this cycle, all from young women of color entering STEM fields. The Bennett Opportunity Scholarship, established with Jade's settlement money from Aurora Airlines, had grown into a substantial foundation supporting underrepresented students in technical fields. Jade served on the selection committee reviewing applications between her research responsibilities. "Send me the finalists' materials," she requested. "I want to review them personally before the meeting." As they concluded their call, Jade returned to her work, the quiet determination that had characterized her response to adversity, now channeled into creating systems that would prevent others from facing similar experiences. The following morning brought another milestone, an invitation to deliver the undergraduate commencement address, an honor typically reserved for seniors rather than juniors. The selection committee's note cited her exceptional contributions to both technical innovation and ethical leadership. Standing at the window of her apartment, gazing out at the MIT campus, illuminated by early spring sunshine, Jade reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The humiliation of being removed from Flight 2237 had been transformed into purpose not through denial or distraction, but through the deliberate application of her talents toward addressing the underlying issues that had enabled that moment. Her reflection was interrupted by a notification from her research assistant. The Bennett algorithm, as their bias detection system had been informally named, had been selected for implementation by the Department of Transportation for reviewing passenger management systems across all federally regulated transportation providers. It was a fitting symmetry. The algorithm she had developed in response to her own experience would now help protect countless others from similar treatment, creating accountability that didn't depend on having a father with the resources to force attention to injustice. Later that week, as she prepared notes for her commencement address, Jade crystallized the philosophy that had emerged from her experience: dignity isn't granted, it's claimed. And sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say, but where you choose to position yourself when the world is watching. In that simple truth lay the essence of both her father's runway blockade and her own response to adversity. The recognition that creating meaningful change often required not just identifying problems, but creating consequences substantial enough to force their address. As she continued drafting her speech, Jade articulated the principle that now guided her work and life. True power isn't about making others feel small to elevate yourself. It's about creating spaces where everyone can stand tall. Sometimes that means using your privilege not as a shield, but as a battering ram against doors that remain closed to others. 3 years after being told she didn't belong in a seat she had every right to occupy, Jade Bennett had not only reclaimed her place, but expanded the definition of belonging itself, creating algorithms, scholarship opportunities, and leadership examples that would help ensure others wouldn't need a runway blockade to secure their rightful place in the world. On the 3rd anniversary of the runway incident, news outlets across the country ran retrospectives analyzing its lasting impact. The consensus was clear: what had begun as one father's dramatic response to his daughter's mistreatment had catalyzed transformations extending far beyond the original context of commercial aviation. When people talk about pulling a Bennett, they're not just referencing a specific incident, explained cultural commentator Rebecca Winters on CNN's anniversary special. They're invoking a philosophy of accountability, the idea that sometimes creating consequences is the only way to force meaningful change in situations where traditional remedies have failed. The phrase had indeed entered the cultural lexicon, appearing everywhere from social media hashtags to academic papers to corporate training sessions. Pulling a Bennett described using available leverage to create consequences substantial enough to force acknowledgement and address of discrimination that might otherwise be minimized or dismissed. What made the concept particularly powerful was its adaptability across contexts and resource levels. While few people had private jets to block runways, the essential principle identifying and utilizing whatever leverage was available to create meaningful consequences could be applied in various settings. Community organizations in cities across the country had established Bennett committees focused on transportation equity monitoring. These volunteer groups collected data on discriminatory patterns in public transit taxi services, ride-share operations, and commercial transportation, creating public accountability through regular reporting and coordinated advocacy. In corporate environments, Bennett reviews had become standard practice in industries beyond aviation. Structured assessments of how customer service policies and practices affected different demographic groups, with particular attention to removal or exclusion decisions. Educational institutions had incorporated the Bennett case study into curricula, ranging from business ethics to civil rights law to corporate communications. Harvard Business School's detailed analysis, from Runway to Reformation. Corporate response to the Bennett incident had become required reading in MBA programs nationwide. The annual Bennett Award for Corporate Accountability had been established by a coalition of civil rights organizations recognizing companies that demonstrated exceptional commitment to equitable practices in customer service. The inaugural recipient, surprisingly, had been Aurora Airlines, acknowledging their comprehensive transformation from the corporate enabler of discrimination to an industry leader in equity initiatives. Perhaps most significantly, the Bennett Initiative for Travel Equity had expanded its mission beyond transportation, establishing programs addressing discriminatory patterns in hospitality, retail, healthcare, and entertainment venues. Its data collection methodologies, legal assistance frameworks, and policy recommendations were being adapted to address inequitable treatment in public spaces more broadly. Dominic Bennett himself had become a sought-after speaker on corporate accountability, addressing audiences ranging from Fortune 500 executive retreats to civil rights conferences to university graduations. His message consistently emphasized that equity wasn't merely a moral imperative, but a practical business necessity, reducing legal exposure, improving operational efficiency, and enhancing brand value through demonstrated commitment to fair treatment. The most profound legacy of the Bennett incident isn't the specific policies it prompted, noted social psychologist Dr. James Washington in his widely cited paper on the phenomenon. It's the fundamental shift in how power dynamics are understood in customer service contexts. The recognition that the responsibility for addressing discrimination lies with those who control the systems rather than those who experience their failures has created a new framework for accountability. This shift was evident in consumer behavior as well. Transportation equity ratings had become standard considerations in travel decisions, with platforms like TripAdvisor and Yelp incorporating bias incident reports into their review frameworks. Companies with strong equity practices highlighted them in marketing materials, recognizing their value as competitive advantages rather than mere compliance requirements. Educational programs inspired by the Bennett case had emerged across academic disciplines. MIT's Algorithms for Equity initiative, partly funded by the Bennett Foundation, focused on developing technical solutions to detect and prevent bias in decision-making systems. Law schools offered specialized courses in transportation equity law, examining the evolving regulatory frameworks that had developed in response to the Runway incident. Media coverage of discrimination in commercial settings had evolved significantly, moving from episodic reporting of individual incidents toward more comprehensive analysis of structural patterns. Journalists increasingly contextualized specific cases within broader frameworks of accountability, often referencing the Bennett case as a turning point in how such stories were understood and addressed. Corporate diversity initiatives had expanded beyond internal hiring and promotion practices to encompass customer experience equity, ensuring that people of all backgrounds received consistent treatment in service interactions. The Bennett Protocol had been adapted for use in retail hospitality and healthcare settings, creating standardized documentation requirements and review processes for service denial or removal decisions. On social media, the hashtag #MyBennettMoment created space for people to share experiences of standing up against discrimination, using whatever leverage they possessed, from a small business owner canceling a contract with a vendor that mistreated his employees, to a teacher restructuring classroom practices to ensure equitable participation, to a community organization coordinating a targeted consumer campaign against a store with documented discriminatory policies. What unified these diverse applications was the core principle illustrated by the Runway blockade that creating meaningful consequences was sometimes necessary to force acknowledgement and address of discrimination that might otherwise be dismissed as isolated incidents rather than recognized as manifestations of structural problems. 3 years after the incident, as a group of transportation equity advocates gathered for their annual conference in Chicago, the keynote speaker offered a reflection that captured the essence of the Bennett legacy. Before the Runway incident, most discrimination in commercial settings was addressed through a predictable cycle. An individual would experience mistreatment, file a complaint, perhaps receive a corporate apology and token compensation, and the system would continue largely unchanged. What Dominic Bennett demonstrated was that this cycle could be interrupted, that with sufficient leverage and determination, individual grievances could be transformed into structural accountability. The speaker continued. What makes this legacy so powerful is its fundamental democracy. While most of us don't have private jets, we all have some form of leverage available to us as consumers, as community members, as citizens. The Bennett principle isn't about replicating one specific action, but about recognizing and utilizing whatever capacity we have to create consequences substantial enough to force acknowledgement of problems that might otherwise be ignored. As the conference concluded, attendees were given lapel pins bearing what had become known as the Bennett Doctrine. Dignity isn't granted, it's claimed. And sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say, but where you choose to position yourself when the world is watching. In that simple truth lay the essence of a societal transformation that had begun with one aircraft positioned across one runway, but had expanded to encompass a fundamental reconsideration of accountability and belonging in shared spaces of all kinds. The world had not become perfect in the 3 years since the Runway incident. Discrimination still occurred, bias still manifested in both individual interactions and institutional patterns. But the framework for addressing such failures had been fundamentally altered, creating pathways for accountability that extended far beyond the specific context that had inspired them. In classrooms, boardrooms, courtrooms, and living rooms across the country, conversations about equity and accountability now included reference to the Bennett case, not as a singular event, but as an illustration of a principle that systems change when the cost of maintaining the status quo becomes greater than the cost of transformation. And in that principle lay the true societal impact of what had begun as one father's refusal to accept his daughter's humiliation without response. Not the specific incident itself, but the recognition that creating consequences powerful enough to force acknowledgement was sometimes the only path to meaningful change in situations where traditional remedies had proven inadequate. What had started as an extraordinary act by someone with extraordinary resources had evolved into a broadly applicable philosophy of accountability available to all, the understanding that dignity must sometimes be claimed rather than granted, and that positioning oneself strategically when the world is watching can create ripples that ultimately reshape the landscape of belonging itself. In the journey of justice, sometimes the most important flights are the ones we prevent from taking off until dignity becomes a non-negotiable part of the itinerary. If this story impacted you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Remember that change begins with all of us in big ways and small. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. We're building a community here dedicated to sharing these important moments that challenge us to be better. Thank you for watching.